Chapter 434. The silver-white light armor wrapped around the slender body, showing the perfect outline of the torso. The cylindrical sensors around the ears and the curve of the chin formed a V-shape. The purple mask covered the upper half of the face, revealing only the thin lips and delicate chin. After the silver mirror was equipped, it had turned into a heart-protecting mirror with mysterious runes engraved on it. Dake raised his head slightly, and an extremely light feeling swept through his body as his toes left the ground. So this is the armed evolution? The feeling of power jumping all over his body made him worry that if he got used to this feeling, he would not be able to adapt to the sluggishness of his body. After a while, he calmed down and felt the changes in the moon god's soul eye. After using the god's personality armament, Moon God, this armed card seemed to have transformed into an inner substance similar to a magic elf card. Dake's current form was presented in the form of a magic elf card. Card name, Moon God God Personality Armament. Remember it in 1 second. https://m. Vipcanchu. VIP type, elf card. Level. Race, fantasy god seed. Attribute, dark. Magic power, 3000. Attack 3000. Defense, 3000. Ultimate skills. God's personality armament, Moon God Mirror, Moon Palace, Lunar Eclipse, only 4 sure kill moves? Dark's eyes narrowed slightly. He was a little puzzled by the feedback he received. The gold card has 4 ultimate skills. I thought the God's card on the gold card would have more than 4 ultimate skills. It seems that the so-called God's card is not in the same system as the white, blue, purple, orange, and gold cards. As for the 6-star level, it's just as expected. The current God's personality armament should be similar to the warrior's soul. As humanoid evolution, it belongs to the category of mature digital beasts, which is equivalent to the second-tier magic elf. As for the attribute, is it still dark? Bliss was indeed the most compatible with dark and fairy. However, Dake could feel the aura of light from the moon god's soul in its normal form. He wouldn't have been surprised if Moon God was a light elemental after the armor evolution, but he didn't expect it to still be a dark elemental. In addition, the moon god's 3 stats were the same as the evil demon beasts. Their 3 stats were all full, but there was nothing extra that stood out. He could only say that it was satisfactory, but there were no surprises. Therefore, he quickly focused his attention on the 4 sure kill skills. The first sure kill skill, God Personality Armament. From the literal meaning, it was very likely that this was a universal killing move that all God Personality Armaments had, and the probability of it being passive was very high. Dake closed his eyes and carefully sensed. From this, he obtained even more information. Divine Personality Armament, passive skill. The Divine Personality Armament possesses the power of God. Not only can it grant the wearer greater power, but it can also raise the wearer's status, rendering most of the transformation-type killing moves targeted at the wearer ineffective. Magic power plus 1000, attack plus 1000, defense plus 1000, status plus 1. This sure kill skill. Dake's eyes were filled with joy. Is this an enhanced version of the Sacred Ring? It does feel a little like a God's card. Magic attack and defense plus 1000 each, allowing Moon God, after the armor evolution, to obtain the 3 stats of 8 stars. Status plus 1 also allows Moon God to go from the 2nd tier to the 3rd tier. As for the immunity to transformation-type killing moves, this means that sure kill moves such as Kettle Kettle, S attack and defense, and Meow Meow, S deception are all ineffective against Moon God. This ensures that Moon God has an advantage when its 3 stats are higher than the opponent's. In fact, this effect might be the core of God Personality Armament. Dake quickly digested this part of the information and immediately understood the second sure kill skill. Moon God Mirror. Moon God Mirror absorbs the moonlight and transforms the power of the moonlight into one's own magic power, allowing God Personality Armament, Moon God, to not consume any magic power during the night. Even during the day, the user can use the power of the moonlight stored in the Moon God Mirror to maintain the consumption of the armament. When necessary, The user can release all the power of the moonlight stored in the Moon God mirror to create a round mirror made of moonlight that can completely block the opponent's attacks for 30 seconds and not be affected by most surekill moves. It's a rechargeable surekill move. I understand now. This Moon God mirror is like an external energy core that can power God personality armament, Moon God. It also has an ability similar to defend. With this Moon God mirror, even if the opponent doesn't have the ability to recover magic power, they can still equip it. In this case, even if the duelist can't fight, this card can still be used. However, I'll have to test which magic fairies can and can't equip. Dake was overjoyed and immediately looked at the third surekill move, Moon Palace Chariot. In fact, among the 4 surekill moves of Moon God, Moon Palace Chariot was the one that Dake was most familiar with. This was because Luo C's Aurora Moon Rabbit card had this surekill move. Moon Palace Chariot creates a huge and beautiful Moon Palace Chariot in the air, causing all living beings within the range of the Moon Palace Chariot to receive a boost in charm and healing. On a full moon night, Moon God's blessing can be used. If Moon God is used, mesmerizing body and moonlight praise can be obtained. Moon God's blessing releases a large area of healing light, causing all living beings within the range of the Moon Palace Chariot to recover 1/3 of their maximum HP. Mesmerizing body. Sometimes, the opposite sex that comes into contact with it will be mesmerized. Moonlight praise absorbs moonlight and recovers 1% of your maximum magic power every second. This surekill move, Dake's eyelids twitched. Moon Palace Chariot was without a doubt a field skill, but he originally thought that it was more of an ornamental type than a practical one. He didn't expect it to have an additional effect on Moon God. Mesmerizing body and moonlight praise. Dake raised his hand and looked at the Diru beast. His fingers were restless as he wanted to test it out. In fact, he was very familiar with mesmerizing body, so there was no need to test it out. In short, the main problem with Moon Palace Chariot is its duration. It can only be maintained for about 3 minutes, and it isn't a field skill like Paradise that can be maintained for a long time. However, the duration of armament evolution is limited, so it shouldn't be a big problem. Dake calmed himself down and finally looked at the last surekill move, Lunar Eclipse. Lunar Eclipse, summon moonlight to attack the target. Each ray of moonlight can cause corrosion damage and stun the target for a short time. You can summon up to 12 rays of moonlight in a row. If released on a full moon night, the power will be doubled. As the last of the 4 surekill moves, Lunar Eclipse was an extremely powerful surekill move. According to Dake's understanding, it was equivalent to 12 rays of moon force that could stun the target for a short time. Others might not be able to use this surekill move well, but if it was used by Fairy Ibu, it would be like an extension of her arm. Dake thought for a moment, then suddenly raised his hand and pointed. A ray of moonlight suddenly shot down and bombarded the ground. The ray of moonlight was very thick, like a pillar of light. After it hit the ground, it surged outwards like a flood. Just the visual effect was shocking. Dake raised his hand again, and a ray of light streaked across the sky. A beautiful moon palace appeared in the sky like a mirage. The moon palace was majestic and beautiful. Looking up, one couldn't help but be mesmerized. Dake didn't move at all. Just by bathing in the moonlight of the Moon Palace Chariot, he could feel the mana he used to release the surekill move quickly recovering. That feeling of being filled up in an instant was really irresistible. Although a 1% recovery rate seems small, with 3,000 points of mana, 1% per second is 30 points per second. I can fully recover 3,000 points in 100 seconds. Dake moved his arms and legs, then with a tap of his toes, he floated up into the sky without any stagnation, and walked in the air. This levitation ability wasn't recorded as a surekill move, but it still couldn't be underestimated. He immediately took a step and ran in the air. The moonlight enveloped his body, making him as light as a swallow and fast as lightning. His dynamic vision also improved, and all kinds of reactions were at his fingertips. Originally, armament transformation already improved his abilities, but armament evolution went one step further. He didn't have to worry about not being able to control it. 15 minutes later, Dake sensed that armament evolution was about to reach the point, and only then did he descend. He then raised his hand slightly, and the magic card Moon God's Soul Eye appeared in his hand. Instantly, a large amount of light overflowed from his body, and then all of it was collected into the magic card. Dake landed lightly under the cover of the remaining moonlight. As expected, he felt his body sink and was slightly uncomfortable. That's about it. This Moon God's armor's cooldown should be about 60 minutes after it's activated. I still need about 45 minutes before I can try out the other armor form. Dake smiled at the magic elves that had unknowingly gathered around him, and then began to clean up the remnants of the experiment. After about 10 minutes, he had put everything into his backpack, leaving only a set of test tubes and a thinking bottle. At this time, the thinking bottle and test tubes were already filled with the Moon God's version of Bliss. If they were properly stored, it would be 2 Bliss 3 Moon. Now he was very confident that by mixing in his own Bliss, he could indeed improve Bliss 3 Moon. However, his Bliss index was only at 80 points, which was far from the standard line that could be extracted. Therefore, he couldn't really try it out for the time being. Then I'll save it first. After making up his mind, Dake put the test tubes and the thinking bottle into his backpack, and prepared to stay in the temple for another half an hour. He would leave the secret passage after testing Great Sin Armament, Bliss. But just as he sat down and was about to rest, he suddenly heard the sound of something shattering. He looked up and saw that the surface of the hollowed-out Moon Goddess statue had an extremely long crack. Then more small cracks appeared around it, and a rumbling sound came from inside the statue. Dake's expression changed and he quickly retreated. Just as he reached the entrance of the temple, the Moon Goddess statue collapsed and turned into dust in an instant. Then the entire temple shook, and it was obvious that it was going to collapse. Sure enough, without the Moon God's remnant soul, this temple will eventually cease to exist. Dake's eyes flashed, and the magic cards in his hand fanned out, and the magic elves around him turned into light, and in the blink of an eye, the little demon beast and the lion beast were beside him. Let's go, lion beast. Okay. The lion beast bent down slightly, and immediately used its thick arms to lift him onto its shoulders. Dake sat on its shoulders and casually put away the last of the paradise. As the light receded, the lion beast suddenly turned around, and the torches on both sides of the passage lit up automatically, continuing to illuminate the path ahead. Rumble! Dake suddenly turned his head, and saw that the majestic temple had collapsed, and billowing smoke rose into the sky, completely drowning the temple. After that, Dake did not stay in the secret passage for long. After nearly 3 hours of running, the lion beast finally ran out of the secret passage. At this time, the closing time was not yet up, and after Dake came out of the secret passage, he put the lion beast back into the magic card, and then quickly walked to the Tower of the Aristocrats, and pushed the door open under the watchful eyes of the feathered serpent magic statue. There was almost no one in the common room, and he exhaled, passed through the common room, and quickly went up the stairs. Not long after, he finally returned to his dormitory. Meow. Dake bent down, reached out and picked up the catnip grass that pounced on him, and then took out the magic clerk to summon. After that, he left the rest of the summoning to it. After putting down his backpack, he could not wait to pick up the Moon Goddess's soul eye again. In the name of Dake Dimung Magic Summoning. The Moon Goddess's soul appeared in the summoning circle, and then looked around curiously, and asked curiously, "Is this your bedroom?" "You can say that." Dake smirked and said, "Can I use you for a while more?" The Moon Goddess's soul. When she turned around in surprise, Dake had already recited the Great Sin Armament, Bliss, as opening sentence. In the name of Dake Dimung, Magic Summoning. As soon as he finished speaking, the strange weapon in the Moon Goddess's soul's hand suddenly shone brightly. In the blink of an eye, the body of the Moon Goddess's soul, including the silver mirror, was absorbed by the weapon, and only the weapon was left floating quietly in the air. This second form, is it a weapon-type equipment? Dake thought, and then reached out his hand to grab it, and suddenly, a stream of information flowed from his fingertips into his brain, and he had a better understanding of this equipment. Card name, Bliss Longing Great Sin Armament. Type, Item Card. Effect, within the range of the light of bliss, all the opponent's weapons will be nullified, and their equipment will be disintegrated. 2 in 1 4000 plus. Chapter 435. Nullify the effects of weapons? Isn't that the defensive ability of the Great Sin armament from Horizon Over the Border? Dake frowned slightly and raised the blissful longing, pointing it lightly at the little fiend. Suddenly, a pink beam shot out from the Warhammer's head and shone on the little fiend's body. Of course nothing happened. The little fiend looked at Dake with a puzzled face, asking doubtfully, "What are you doing?" Dake said casually, "Just watch." The little fiend's face suddenly darkened. There wasn't much need to test the blissful longing's weapon nullification ability. What Dake wanted to test was the effect of the weapon nullification. But the only weapon he really needed to equip was the godly persona armament, Moon God. The two were two forms of the same weapon card, so he naturally couldn't test them out. That's not right. There is one more person who can see the effect of the weapon nullification. Dake thought, and immediately had the fairy Ibu, who had just been summoned, put on the moonlight dress. The first website is https://m. But can't you? VI. Although the fairy Ibu was a little confused, she still obediently took out the weapon card from her little wardrobe and handed it to Dake with both hands. Dake immediately used the usual summoning to activate the moonlight dress. A circle of pink light then appeared around the fairy Ibu's waist and gradually turned into a cute little dress. The fairy Ibu stood up like a person, tiptoeing in a circle, and the little dress emitted a mesmerizing brilliance, making her even more adorable. Dake then whispered, "Coming." The fairy Ibu, squeak. Dake immediately pointed the blissful longing at her, and the fairy Ibu was reflected in the light of bliss. The moonlight dress on her body then nullified, turning into magical starlight, and burrowing back into the magic card. Dake turned back to look at the moonlight dress in his hand, and found that it had already turned into a grayish-white from the exhaustion of magic. Clearly, it couldn't be used for a while. Is this the weapon nullification? If it's not a magic card, it probably won't return to the card, but it will most likely leave the body and temporarily lose its power. This is simply a nightmare for a deck that focuses on weapons and armors. Dake suddenly came back to his senses and couldn't help but ponder. I just don't know if it will work on high-level weapons and equipment. In any case, it's still a divine card. Its authority shouldn't be low. And it doesn't seem to be on cooldown? Just as Dake was deep in thought, the pink glow on blissful longing suddenly dimmed and stopped glowing. He was silent for a moment. Then he quickly looked up at the clock and calculated. It lasts for about 3 minutes, but it's already very terrifying. Moreover, during this 3-minute duration he didn't consume any mana, but he could clearly feel the power of bliss fluctuating. This may limit the number of people who can use this card. Dake's gaze shifted slightly as an idea formed in his mind. But now that it was almost midnight and he was tired from the day, he was not in the mood to continue. Moreover, this divine card was already in his hands, so there was no need to rush. Then what I need to do now is to inject bliss into the insect tree and store it. After everything was done, Dake got into bed and felt comfortable. The harvest from this trip to the secret passage was much more than he expected. Especially the crafting of Moon God's Soul Eye. It was simply a pleasant surprise. Now that he had Moon God's Soul Eye in hand, Flower Card also had a source. If he could study Love Magic Circle thoroughly in the future, he could make Flower Card himself without worrying about Flower Card losing its effect. In particular, the 2 armors of Moon God's Soul Eye didn't require the wearer's mana consumption. Divine Personality Armament, Moon God S armament evolution had its own energy core, while Great Sin armament, Bliss, consumed soul energy. Therefore, it could be worn by the enchanted fairy. Moreover, armament evolution didn't seem to require the wearer's body size. After all, it was evolving into a digital beast. The only limitation was that it could only be worn by Bliss' enchanted fairies. However, in Dake's deck, there were quite a few enchanted fairies that relied on Bliss. He counted a little. There was Dream Demon, Milk Jar, Fairy Ibu, and Vampire's Daughter. If he had to count, Chio Sea Lion actually had bliss in its body. In addition, Illusory Beast, Ibu, Curse Cage, Little Demon, and Illusory Beast, Ever-Changing Beast could all use Bliss's Great Sin card to evolve or increase their stars. In short, this Moon God Soul Eye card was very versatile. The next day, Monday, after a day of classes, Dake immediately rushed back to the dormitory and chose an enchanted fairy to experiment with armament evolution. Let's start with Qiuqiu Sea Lion. After careful consideration, he waved his hand at Qiuqiu Sea Lion. Momo. Qiuqiu Sea Lion's eyes lit up and quickly jumped out of the air cushion pool. Before the water droplets that were brought out by it scattered, they gathered into a huge water ball in the blink of an eye and were placed on top of its head. Among Dake's enchanted fairies, even the trashiest slime had a chance to shine. On the other hand, this basic 2-star enchanted fairy was becoming more and more inconspicuous, which made it secretly depressed. Especially after Greed 3 was refined, it had nothing to do with it, which made it secretly sad for a long time. Now that there was finally a new opportunity, of course it wanted to fight for it. Dake hugged Qiuqiu Sea Lion, then lifted the water ball and placed it in the pool on the experiment table. He smiled at it and said, "Next I'm going to test the feasibility of using armament evolution on you. You need to work hard." Qiuqiu Sea Lion immediately nodded. Dake put it back on the ground and directly used a normal summoning spell to activate Moon God's Soul Eye's Godhead armament. In an instant, the afterimage of the Moon God's soul appeared behind Qiuqiu Sea Lion and opened its arms to hug it. Qiuqiu Sea Lion, armament evolution. Qiuqiu Sea Lion's body suddenly floated up and became a shining object under the Moon God's power. Its body changed dramatically under the moonlight, and there were obvious signs of evolution. Dake's heart calmed down a little. Qiuqiu Sea Lion's armament evolution experiment was the most important because when Dake refined it, he only used 2 Fruit of Bliss's remaining roots, and Bliss 3 was not enough to make it evolve completely. Jealousy was probably the most compatible with it, and Bliss was only a small part of it. If even Qiuqiu Sea Lion could successfully armament evolution, then other enchanted fairies with the Bliss factor should also be able to do it. After that, all he needed to do was to experiment on enchanted fairies without the Bliss factor to get the final conclusion. In just a moment of thinking, Qiuqiu Sea Lion's armament evolution was completed. Moon God, who was covered in silver armor, appeared under the moonlight with an awe-inspiring posture. Dark immediately checked the magic card and found that the Moon God, evolved from the Sea Lion's Moon God, and his own Moon God, were not much different in terms of data. Even if he looked carefully, he could only see some differences from the outside. For example, Qiuqiu Sea Lion's Moon God had a little blue pattern on its face, and the lower half of its face that was exposed outside the mask was more feminine. But that was it. Very good. Dake gave his approval to Qiuqiu Sea Lion's armament evolution. Qiuqiu Sea Lion immediately pounced on him happily and pressed him to the ground in an instant. Qiuqiu Sea Lion, who was trying to evolve for the first time, obviously didn't understand its sudden increase in strength. Dake laid on the ground, and he was hit by a strawberry. An hour later, Dake changed his experiment subject and put Little Devil in front of him. Then he used Godly Personality Armament, Moon God. When the light shone, the afterimage of the Moon God's soul appeared behind Little Devil, but Little Devil didn't change at all. Dake looked at the enchanted card and found that Moon God's Soul Eye was already in cooldown. After another hour, he first let the Little Devil Beast evolve into a Haidalu Beast, and used the Divine Personality Armament, Moon God, of the Moon God Soul Eye on it again. The Heidi Road Beast evolved into Moon God very smoothly. At this point, the experiment results were very clear. After Dake carefully recorded it in his notebook, he tried it every hour so that all the enchanted fairies with the Bliss factor would have the experience of armament evolution. Among the 2 forms of Moon God's Soul Eye, Godly Personality Armament, Moon God, would become his usual move, and Great Sin Armament, Bliss, would be a trump card that could counter armament. Therefore, it was necessary to let the enchanted fairies get used to armament evolution. In the last few days of April, Dake used Moon God's Soul Eye and Greed 3 alternately every day so that the enchanted fairies could master their respective forms of evolution as much as possible. He himself continued to study Soul Loss Curse, and finally had some insights at the end of the month. In the blink of an eye, it was May. Shengmalian Academy finally entered the busy end of the semester, and the school championship was officially put on the agenda. It seemed that it wasn't until May that the students suddenly realized that there was a school championship. All the students, including the first years, had extra attention to the point comparison of the school championship. Although the first years couldn't participate in the school championship to obtain a huge amount of temporary credits, the results of the final exam would also be converted into temporary credits, and it would have a small but real impact on the final school championship. When the gap between the credits of the two branches was relatively small, it could also be decided. And every month, the students would involuntarily become grandet. Some people could use their credits to make money and get more credits, but some people couldn't. Therefore, what they could do was to save as much as possible until the end of the month. Of course, there were also some people who didn't care about this, or they could use their credits relatively freely when they had a huge advantage. At this time, the students would unconsciously compete with each other. In short, from the perspective of a bystander, it was quite interesting. As in previous years, the actual total credits of the 4 branches are not very different. In the end, it still depends on the school championship to determine the winner. At 8 o'clock in the evening on May 1st, Dake, Deanna, and Luosi were drinking black tea in the common room. From this time onwards, the students could check the total credits of the 4 branches from the branch card. The final total credits, which was the basis of the school championship, were divided into 2 parts: actual credits and temporary credits. Look at this button. It can divide the total credits of each branch into 7 parts and display them in the form of a histogram. When Deanna waved the branch card, her eyes suddenly lit up, and she pointed to the card and said. Dake leaned over to take a look, and also transformed the total credits into a histogram. The total credits of each branch were divided into 7 pillars, which were the actual credits of the 1st to 6th grades, and the temporary credits of the entire branch. Because the school championship had not yet begun, the temporary credits were temporarily 0. The actual credit pillars of the other 6 grades were roughly arranged from lowest to highest. The 1st grade had the lowest credit pillar, and the 5th grade had the highest credit pillar. In contrast, the actual credits of the 1st grade were indeed negligible. This was very consistent with the lack of ways to obtain credits for the 1st grade. As for the 6th grade's credit pillar, it was slightly higher than the 2nd and 3rd grades. This was mostly because the 6th grade was about to graduate, so they had to convert all their credits into resources and make full use of them. Of course, these were the results of comparison. In fact, the actual total credits of each branch was not too much. After all, the expenses of the students in the school were also very high. Whether it was studying, living, or research, they all needed to consume a lot of credits. Therefore, the final school championship often depended on the temporary credits to determine the final winner. The temporary credits were divided into 2 parts. One was the temporary credits converted from the final exam scores, and the other was the temporary credits obtained from the school championship. The former was calculated according to the total score of each grade in the branch divided by the number of students in each grade x 1,000. Although the total amount was not low, around 100,000, the score difference between the branches was usually not that big. The latter school championship was generally divided into 2 parts, which were the dungeon adventure and the duel competition. Tens of thousands of temporary credits could be obtained from both. It's a pity that the 1st grade can't participate, Dake said with some regret. When he had just obtained the new card, he was really eager to try it out. Especially the duel competition. It made him excited just thinking about it. Unfortunately, no matter how much he hoped, he could only be a spectator in the 1st grade. I wonder how the research on Senior Panduola's fusion factor is going? Maybe I can see her fusion sprite in the school championship? Dake's thoughts moved slightly, and he was somewhat looking forward to it. The dungeon adventure was a team competition, but the duel competition was an individual competition. With Senior's temperament, she should only represent the 4th grade magic engineering department in the duel competition. However, as a member of the aristocrat house, it was not good to cheer her on. After Dake drank the black tea, he said goodnight to the two people. He still had experiments to do tonight. 2-in-1-4/100 plus. Chapter 436. When Dake returned to his dorm, he looked at the moon god's version of bliss that was still stored in the thinking bottle, and scratched his head. He had originally planned to store the moon god's version of bliss in the insect tree, but there were only 8 branches on the insect tree. Even though each branch of the insect tree was well developed and could store 3 drops of great sin, it could only store 24 drops of great sin. Currently, his pride had 6 points and greed had 1 point. Because they had been condensed, they were about 5 points. However, because the great sins could not be mixed, he needed 3 branches to store them. That way, there were only 5 branches left that could be used to store the moon god's version of bliss. In other words, he could only store 15 drops of the moon god's version of bliss. That left 45 drops of the moon god's version of bliss. In order to store the 45 drops of the moon god's version of bliss, Dake borrowed another thinking bottle from Professor Kazair when he returned the set of test tubes. However, the moon god's version of bliss in these 2 thinking bottles had reached its limit. If he did not use it soon, he was afraid that there would be none left. That was why he planned to make the best use of it tonight. Remember the website, MVIP can't you? VIP. Under normal circumstances, the moon god's version of bliss would have a problem of losing control. Therefore, a little bit of Dake's own bliss was needed to assist in the control. After all, bliss and bliss came from the same source, so it was not easy for there to be a conflict. However, the current situation was that only the moon god's version of bliss was left in Dake's hands. Moreover, his own index of bliss was only 80 points, so he could not use the dragonfly skimming the water method to draw it. If there was no other way, he could only try to mix in other great sins. However, before that, he needed to do an experiment on the beginner-level soul loss curse. System, expand the index. Dake ordered. A moment later, 7 indicators appeared in his field of vision. Pride, 95 envy, 39 fury, 82 sloth, 69 greed, 95 gluttony, 73 bliss, 80 compared to the beginning of the previous month. Great sins had dropped a lot, especially bliss, which had dropped to 80 points and could not be used at all. As for pride and greed, they remained at the standard line of 95 points. Similarly, they couldn't be drawn using the dragonfly skimming the water method. Fortunately, there was a breakthrough in the beginner-level soul loss curse. Otherwise, he would have to seek the growth of great sins. I wonder if I can lower the safe absorption threshold to 80 points this time. If I can, I don't have to take the risk. I just have to think of a way to increase bliss by 1 or 2 points, and that will be enough. Anyway, let's give it a try first. Little demon beast. Dake called out to the little fiend. Coming. The little demonic beast immediately jumped down from above and stood on the table, shaking its little butt. Dake said softly, "This time, we will test the safety of the soulless curse." Soulless curse? The little demon beast squinted its eyes and thought for a while. Finally, it remembered the beginner-level soulless curse experiment. Then, it patted its belly with its wings and looked up. Touch the big one. Dake couldn't help but smile. He immediately used a simple spell to cast the soulless curse. About a minute later, he raised his magic pen and pointed it between the little demon beast's eyebrows. Soulless curse. A beam of light instantly shot out. After the little demon beast was hit, it was slightly dazed, but it still stood there perfectly fine. Dake observed carefully and thought, "It seems that this beginner-level soulless curse is indeed much more effective than the beginner-level soulless curse. Even with Professor Harvey's improvements, it's still hard to avoid a slight daze. This is not a good sign. When using the magic brain dropper to draw great sins, if there was a serious daze, the consequences would be very serious. This beginner soulless curse, as daze effect was still very weak, but what if it was intermediate or advanced? This meant that if Professor Harvey's improvements were indeed at the limit, then the intermediate and advanced soulless curse could no longer be used to safely draw great sins. After Dake recorded his findings, he used the happy card on the little demon beast. After being hit by the happy card, the little demon beast was obviously more intoxicated than when it was not under the soulless curse. As for the other disadvantages, they did not show. Dake carefully thought for a long time, and finally decided to experiment on himself. I won't use the underworld spirit spell with it for now. I'll just test the effect of this beginner, soulless curse. He calmed down a little and pointed at his temple to cast the beginner version of the soulless curse. Soulless curse. At that moment, he could clearly feel a slight tremor in his brain, and he was in a daze, unable to focus. His eyes narrowed. He gritted his teeth and forced his mind to focus. After a while, he finally managed to withstand it. If I use this soulless curse multiple times, it might even have a training effect on my mind. He shook his head slightly. Then, before the effect of the soulless curse disappeared, he picked up the magic brain dropper from the experiment table, closed his eyes, and focused his mind to sense it. He first chose pride, which was already at 95 points. When he activated his emotions, he could clearly feel that there were traces of emotions floating out. However, he did not use the magic dropper to draw it. Instead, he used his senses, which had been honed for a long time, to sense the great sins. The amount of overflow is about 5 points. Only to bring the standard to 90 points? Dake could not help but frown. He immediately adjusted his thoughts, put away pride, and activated bliss, which was at 80 points. Bliss could be said to be the easiest great sins to activate, but no matter how hard he tried, he could not make bliss overflow. After 3 minutes, Dake relaxed. At this point, he was very sure that this beginner soulless curse could only bring the standard to 90 points, and it could not go any further. 90 points. Based on the current situation, I can get pride and greed. If I have to choose between the two, I'll naturally choose pride. Dake did not hesitate in this regard. He first rested for half an hour, then used soulless curse and underworld spirit spell at the same time to trigger pride to overflow out of his head, and he successfully extracted a 1.5-point drop of pride. This way he had 7.5 points of pride and 1 point of greed in his hand. 2 experiments. One is the cultivation of pride and the creation of dragon seed, and the other is the creation of bliss 3, moon. Let's start with the easy ones. Dake took a deep breath and took out the materials and tools that he had prepared beforehand. First, he began the creation of bliss 3, moon. At the beginning of the experiment, he was already prepared for failure. After all, the so-called 7 great sins had different attributes and characteristics, especially pride and bliss, which represented the sun and the moon, light and darkness. They were completely opposite existences. If he simply mixed them together, there would be a high probability of conflict. As for greed and bliss, they had a certain degree of compatibility. At least in terms of emotions, there was not much conflict. In fact, Dake had wanted to experiment with great sins for a long time, but he actually needed a lot of great sins, and he did not have any extra to waste. This time, although he was forced to do so, he finally caught a chance. With 1 point of greed and 30 points of bliss as the main experiment materials, he could prove something. After he was ready, Dake placed a blank magic card in the middle of the table and immediately began the creation. He was already very familiar with the creation of Great Sin card, so he did not have to worry about failure. After a short while, he had boiled brain juice and sealing fluid, and he smeared the brain juice evenly on the blank magic card. After the brain juice was smeared, Dake carefully picked up the magic brain dropper and pulled out greed first. The purpose of putting in greed first was to better observe the reaction between bliss and greed. Compared to Dake's bliss, the moon god's bliss was diluted by 3 times, except for the lack of some special factors. 1 drop of bliss was equivalent to 1/3 of Dake's bliss. It was actually easier to observe if he used it. Chirp, chirp, chirp. Dake placed the magic brain dropper with 1 point of greed on the blank magic card and squeezed hard on the magic brain. As the magic brain screamed, the point of greed was dripped onto the card, and under the effect of brain juice, it quickly spread. That blank magic card was dyed with a dull blue hue. Dake focused slightly and took out a drop of bliss from the thinking bottle. He then placed the tip of the magic dropper on the blank magic card and squeezed hard on the magic brain. Drip! The drop of pink liquid that fell from the air quickly dripped onto the card that had been dyed blue by greed. The faint pink color was like a layer of oil floating on water, completely separated from greed. Dake did not immediately make a decision, but continued to observe. However, after about 3 minutes of observation, he still shook his head. It was slightly different from his judgment. Greed and bliss could not be combined at all. The two types of great sins might not be conflicting, but they were not combined either. If that's the case, should I continue or stop my losses? Dake frowned slightly. Pure greed and bliss cannot be combined naturally, but that doesn't mean they cannot be combined under the influence of external forces. Perhaps the final refinement can cause these two types of great sins to combine to a certain extent. Just like the Diru beast and the black Diru beast, they are also the combination of pride and bliss. After careful consideration, he chose to continue. No investment, no return. This was not the time to be stingy with one or two materials. Therefore, he continued to inject bliss until the estimated 30 points of bliss of the moon god version were all injected. He then applied sealing fluid on the top and began to engrave the refinement array. In the end, the refinement array was successfully activated. Dake could clearly sense the internal reaction of the magic card, but he still had to wait for the actual situation. He was not in a hurry. He waited until the magic card was finally formed before he picked it up and cleaned it. The final magic card that was formed was still pink as usual. There was only a blue dot in the middle that represented greed. However, this blue dot did not have any other color mixed in. From the surface, greed and bliss still have not been combined. It seems like they are just stacked together. Let's see the effect. After preliminary observation, Dake injected magic to obtain information. This card, let's call it Bliss 3, Moon for now. After careful analysis, he could not help but frown with a strange look. From the description of Bliss 3, Moon, there was no trace of greed at all. It was as if that 1 point of greed was completely sandwiched by 30 points of bliss of the moon god version. There was neither conflict nor fusion. It had nothing to do with the magic card itself. He thought for a moment and summoned the little devil beast again. This time, the little devil beast could not help but show a bitter expression. He carefully probed. Is it that? Dake nodded. Yes, it is that. Wah. The little devil beast screamed and subconsciously turned to run. But suddenly its body stiffened and it did not move. From the corner of its eyes, it saw the little dream demon snickering by the wall. She had used her ultimate skill, telekinesis. Then Dake took the opportunity to activate Bliss 3 Moon. They cooperated well. The little devil beast bathed in the light of Bliss 3 Moon. Its body changed dramatically and in the blink of an eye, it broke free from the dream demon's superpower. After successfully evolving into a Heidi Road beast, its eyes turned into the shape of a pig. It subconsciously pounced on Dake. Stop! However, as soon as Dark gave the order, it stopped in its tracks and stood still in its original position. In other words, although greed didn't take effect, Bliss 3 Moon became controllable. Dake's eyes revealed joy as he immediately tried to analyze it. After a long while, he found a clue and wrote in his notebook. I'm afraid it's the special factor contained in that drop of greed that changed Bliss 3 Moon. The 30 points of the moon god's version of bliss suppressed the 1 point of greed, but it couldn't suppress that special factor. Let's call it the demon god factor. No, let's call it the Dake factor. I can confirm that this factor definitely exists. As for whether or not it belongs to the demon god, it's hard to say. Also, I don't know what effect this factor has. Perhaps the reason why the Great Sin card can gain intelligence and why the Great Sin can protect the soul from being destroyed is related to this special Dake factor. Tisk, it's a bit embarrassing to use my own name to name it. Should I change it? 2 in 1 4000 plus, fusion factor, plus fruit of pride dragon, plus dragon's reverse scale plus white dragon pearl equals. Chapter 437. Of course, it was pointless to dwell on the name. Dake successfully obtained the improved version of Bliss 3, Moon. But it also raised a lot of questions. First, it was about the method and meaning of combining two or more types of great sins. Next, it was about the meaning of the existence of the Dake factor, and whether or not it could be used. Finally, it was about the changes in dueling tactics brought about by the improved version of the Bliss 3, Moon. Of course, the last one was the least important, but it was the closest one. It's already 11 o'clock? After concluding the experiment, Dake looked up at the clock on the wall. He estimated that he was a little tired and didn't have enough time, so he decided to leave the experiment for tomorrow. The next day was Wednesday, so he planned to continue the experiment on Wednesday afternoon. But before that, he washed the dragon grass and fed it 3 points of pride, causing a fresh green sprout to grow on top of its head. Even though feeding the cat grass, with 7 points of great sins, would allow him to obtain a fruit of great sins smoothly, every time Dark did it, he felt like he was pulling up the seedling to help it grow. Remember this. https://m. But can't you? VIP. So as long as he had time, he would give the fruit some time to grow. There was no class on Wednesday afternoon, so he had plenty of time. Dark pushed back the refining of the second Bliss 3, Moon to the evening and began to refine a magic guide fairy that he hadn't refined in a long time. Unlike the refinement of the Bliss 3, Moon, Dake prioritized crafting a dragon seed. The materials he planned to use this time were all extremely rare and hard to come by. Among them, the dragon's reverse scale was the most precious and had an extraordinary meaning. Therefore, while he was extremely enthusiastic, he was also extremely cautious. At the beginning of the experiment, he first listed the refinement formula in his notebook. Fusion factor, plus fruit of pride dragon, plus dragon's reverse scale plus white dragon pearl equals? Among the 4 materials, Dake was only unclear about the dragon's reverse scale. As for the other 3 materials, he knew more about them. However, in this set of equations, the dragon's reverse scale was actually the core. Hence, he couldn't estimate what grade of magic conducting fairy he would be able to refine this time. He could only look forward to it. Anyway, feed the remaining pride to the dragon grass first. Dark put down his pen, got up and walked to the side of the dragon grass. He pinched its armpits and hugged it in his arms. The dragon grass subconsciously shrank into his arms. After being raised for so long, this dragon grass was still a little timid. It only had passion for narrow and dark environments. Dake carried it to the balcony and opened the guardrail of the worm tree, so that it could suck on the worm branches. The dragon grass, which had tasted pride for the first time last night, couldn't help but suck greedily at the moment. When it had finished sucking on one branch, Dark used the magic brain dropper to separate a little of the remaining pride and injected it back into the branch that had been sucked dry, allowing it to continue sucking. The flower of pride that was gradually blooming on top of its head emitted a faint light. Inside the flower of pride, the lower part of the stamen's ovary was rapidly expanding. The ovule was born and grew, gradually developing into a fruit. The beautiful dark golden petals were withering at a speed visible to the naked eye. When the dragon grass raised its head in satisfaction, all the petals had withered into powder. There was only a round fruit and a stem left on top of its head. Dake carefully plucked the fiery red fruit, then cut off the stem and stored it carefully. Until now, Dake had stored several stems of the fruit of great sin. When the time came, they could be used as supplementary materials. He smiled and called for kettle pot. He put the round fruit of pride into its cave and ordered it to start brewing. By the time the fruit of pride had turned into a fruit juice, all the ingredients were ready. This time he used the dragon seed, light attribute refining method. Although there was some randomness, he had more or less done some guidance. Dake calmed himself down and carefully began the experiment. Almost an hour later, he injected mana to activate the first refining formation. First, he threw in supplementary materials, saliva, and other catalysts into the refining formation. Then he slowly poured the juice of the pride into it. The interior of the first refining formation formed a dark golden nebula with traces of fiery red. The fiery red was gradually drawn into the center and gathered into a blazing sun. Around the nebula, There was blue flowing like water. That was the symbol of the water attribute. Dake looked at the dragon's reverse scale and the white dragon pearl that had been processed. He chose to put the white dragon pearl into the refining formation first. As the white dragon pearl was placed into the refining formation, the light attribute of the pride was gradually drawn out. He injected mana and continued to stir, guiding more of the light attribute out. The nebula in the refining formation gradually turned from dark golden to a blazing white color. When all the attributes had shifted to the light attribute, Dake put the dragon's reverse scale in. His expression became more and more serious, and his control of mana became more and more precise. That piece of reverse scale that was floating in the nebula was gradually being refined. The light of the refining formation suddenly shone brightly. It's done. Dake's heart skipped a beat, and he immediately adjusted the output of his mana. When the light of the refining formation reached its peak, it suddenly converged. The entire refining formation shrank into the card surface. The surface of the card flashed from time to time, and the frequency was getting faster and faster. Dake observed the changes of the magic card seriously. About 2 minutes later, some black substance suddenly overflowed from the surface of the card and suddenly increased. It was like a pool of mud that completely covered the surface of the card. After another 2 minutes, the reaction of the magic card finally stopped. Dake used a tool to remove the mud and saw the light cocoon hidden within. Looks like it went well. Dake couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. He then took a mercury knife and carefully cut open the light cocoon from top to bottom. Almost at that moment, a holy aura suddenly erupted. White light poured out from the gap like a flood, illuminating the entire bedroom. Dake took a deep breath and raised his hand. The magic elves' gazes followed the white light, and all of them looked over. Another light elemental magic guide fairy? The Diru beast walked over with small steps, frowning slightly. Dake nodded. It should be. I hope it's a dragon that can be ridden. In fact, when he saw Claire riding a dragon and leaving before Christmas, he had kept a thought. After all, who didn't want to ride a dragon? When the white light disappeared, Dake used a pair of tweezers to pick up the magic card that was covered with black stains. He then rinsed it in the sink. As the surface of the magic card was gradually exposed to the air, a faint golden halo was emitted. It's actually a gold card? Looks like the quality of that dragon scale is indeed not low. Then the probability of refining a high-star dragon species is even higher. Dake's eyes lit up, and he immediately took the clean magic card in front of him. The first thing he noticed was the stars on the card surface, a total of 6 stars. But there's only 6 stars? Although 6 stars was the highest star in the second tier, it was only the second tier after all. Dake originally thought that this time, it was possible to refine a third-tier magic card. If it was a blue-eyed white dragon, it might even be 8 stars. In other words, if it was 6 stars, it couldn't be a blue-eyed white dragon. Dake's gaze couldn't help but move down and look at the magic elf on the card surface. This caused his slightly dimmed eyes to light up again. Although the magic elf on the card surface wasn't a blue-eyed white dragon, it was very similar to the one in his impression. They were both silver dragons with blue eyes. The difference between the dragon species in front of him and the blue-eyed white dragon was that it was abnormally young. Yes, this was a young dragon. A 6-star young dragon. Dake observed carefully. The more he looked, the more he felt that its appearance was very similar to the blue-eyed white dragon. He had some guesses in his heart, and then he immediately injected magic into the magic card and obtained information from it. Card name, blue-eyed young dragon. Type, elf card. Level, race, dragon species. Attribute, light. Magic power, 2500. Attack, 3000. Defense, 2500. Ultimate skill, dragon egg transformation. Call of the young dragon. Dragon's reverse scale, light morning hall. Blue-eyed young dragon? It can't be a young blue-eyed white dragon, right? Dake rubbed the corner of his eyes. Then he looked at the attack and defense of the blue-eyed young dragon, which were the classic 3000 points and 2500 points respectively. He couldn't help but let out a knowing smile. 6-star dragon species, light attack type. Although it's a young dragon, it has the exact same attack and defense as the blue-eyed white dragon in Yu-Gi-Oh! Let me see its ultimate skill. Dake first looked at the ultimate skill that interested him the most, Dragon Egg Transformation. He had a feeling that this ultimate skill that he had never heard of might be the essence of this blue-eyed young dragon. Dragon Egg Transformation. Return to the beginning. The blue-eyed young dragon can retract the essence of its whole body and transform back into a dragon egg, and then return to its original state. Transform back into a dragon egg and return to its original state? Is this an ultimate skill that's equivalent to the Phoenix's nirvana? Dake couldn't help but think. A ultimate skill that could return to its original state, no matter how he looked at it, was a very good skill. However, he could also imagine that this ultimate skill would have an extremely long cooldown. Perhaps it was the same as the Moon Palace Chariot, which was an ultimate skill that had a cooldown of 24 hours. But that's not for sure. It depends on how long it takes for it to hatch after it turns into a dragon egg, and how strong the dragon egg's defense is. If it can be easily destroyed when it's in its egg state, then it won't work. Anyway, I'll have to try to find out. Dake left the suspense and continued to look at the second ultimate skill. Call of the Young Dragon. Call of the Young Dragon. When the blue-eyed young dragon is in danger, it will call to the sky and summon a white dragon with green eyes to its side. A summon ultimate skill? Dake's eyes couldn't help but light up. If the dragon egg transformation didn't bring him too much of a surprise, then the call of the young dragon completely made up for the missing part. As the saying goes, if you beat the small one, the big one will come. This blue-eyed young dragon could use the call of the young dragon to summon a blue-eyed white dragon, and perhaps even various subspecies of the blue-eyed white dragon. This was obviously a very powerful ultimate skill that could allow the blue-eyed white dragon and other blue-eyed white dragons in the deck to be directly summoned without any cost. Although it was clearly stated that it was temporary, a 3 to 4 minutes duration of the summon was enough. The only problem was, there had to be at least one blue-eyed white dragon or other blue-eyed white dragon. Although Dake had cultivated the blue-eyed young dragon, it would be very difficult to cultivate a second one. Although the cultivation this time was very close to success, it still wasn't complete. Moreover, the various materials needed to cultivate it were also very difficult to obtain. At least, he wouldn't be able to think about it in the short term. But even so, it still couldn't change the fact that this was a powerful ultimate skill. If Dake could cultivate more than one blue-eyed white dragon one day, he could use this blue-eyed young dragon as the core to build a blue-eyed card set. He immediately looked at the third ultimate skill, Dragon's Reverse Scale. Dragon's Reverse Scale. The blue-eyed young dragon shatters its reverse scale and enters a state of rage. Its attack will be greatly increased by 50% to 100%. But it will enter a state of confusion. Lasts for 3 minutes. A classic, berserk ultimate skill at the cost of losing one's rationality. The only advantage is that its attack power is increased by quite a bit. Dake shook his head slightly. He didn't like this kind of ultimate skill that would cause the magic elf to be unable to differentiate between friend and foe. Fortunately, it had a duration, so it was still manageable in this aspect. Next is the last ultimate skill. He immediately looked at the last ultimate skill. Hall of Light. Hall of Light. The blue-eyed young dragon offers a prayer and summons the Hall of Light. The light magic elf that dies in the Hall of Light will be reborn in the form of a spirit. The Hall of Light will last for 3 minutes. The spirit will last for 3 minutes, and will not be affected by the disappearance of the Hall of Light. Another field skill. And it's a field skill that can allow the magic elf to be reborn temporarily. Dake suddenly had an idea. He knew that there was a field magic card in Yu-Gi-Oh! That was also called Hall of Light, but the effects of the two were obviously different. This is obviously a core ultimate skill that can be used to build a light element card set. It's a pity that among my magic elf, only the Diru beast has the light element. In conclusion, this blue-eyed young dragon is a magic elf card with great potential, but it doesn't seem to be compatible with my current card set. Dake thought carefully for a moment and decided to summon this blue-eyed young dragon to take a look. Perhaps there are still areas that I haven't studied thoroughly. 2 in 1 4000 plus. Chapter 438. To summon a 6-star magic guide spirit. Dake would need close to an hour with his current speed if he were to use a normal summoning spell, and he couldn't stop. Therefore, he could only use a sacrificial summoning spell. However, with the Greedy Slime 2, even a sacrificial summoning would be more convenient. Let's give it a try. Dake immediately took out Greedy Slime 3, then walked in front of the trash slime, picked it up and said, "I'll leave the rest to you." Gulyalu, the trash slime, rubbed against his hand, showing a trace of happiness. Dake then used a normal summoning spell and quickly activated Greedy Slime 3. The trash slime instantly evolved into Greedy Slime 2 in the light. Looking at the huge slime in front of him, Dake ordered, "Use Divide Works." Pew! The Greedy Slime 2 lightly shook its body, and from its body, 3 Greedy Slime eyes split out. First website. https://m. Vipcanchu. VIP. These 3 Greedy Slime eye clearly lacked intelligence, and were generally clumsier than a magic guide spirit with intelligence level 2. 0. However, the meaning of their existence was to become a sacrifice, so it didn't matter if they were intelligent or not. Dake immediately began to summon. There are 3 2-star magic guide spirits, using these 3 Greedy Slime eye as a sacrificial summoning. Young Green-Eyed Dragon. Instantly, these 3 Greedy Slime eye turned into light, and gathered with the white light that shot out from the Young Green-Eyed Dragon card, quickly weaving into a huge sacrificial summoning circle. And that Young Green-Eyed Dragon was conjured from this sacrificial summoning circle. It was also at this time that Dake suddenly realized that the so-called Young Dragon was only for the group of dragons. This Young Green-Eyed Dragon, that was just born not long ago, was nearly 3 meters tall, even taller than a lion beast. Although its appearance gave people a feeling of roundness, and its big green eyes were quite cute, but its mountain-like body still gave people a heavy sense of oppression when standing in front of it. As a refined product of the fruit of pride, this young blue-eyed dragon had already gained intelligence even without the use of the Great Sin card. However, it was slightly different from the Diru beast, which was also the incarnation of pride. It didn't seem to be as cold. Dake thought for a moment and stretched out his hand. The young green-eyed dragon obediently lifted one of its claws and gently placed it on his palm. Of course, due to the difference in size between the 2 palms, Dake's entire hand was covered. However, the young green-eyed dragon obviously did not exert any strength. It only widened its eyes after lifting its claws, and kept staring at Dake, as if trying its best to remember his appearance. Perhaps its arrogance is more hidden in its heart. Dake scratched the palm of the young green-eyed dragon, then retracted his hand and said softly, "Let's try Dragon Egg transformation first." The young green-eyed dragon tilted its head, then opened its hands and held them above its head. After putting its palms together, it stood upright on one leg and spun around. Wah 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 wah! After a burst of cheerful cries, the young green-eyed dragon closed its petals like a flower and turned back into a flower bud. The energy fluctuations it emitted out quickly converged, and its entire body shrunk rapidly in the light, turning into an egg shape. When the light disappeared, it had become a huge egg about 1.5 meters tall. Dake picked up the young green-eyed dragon magic card and was ready to check its status change. But when he fixed his gaze, he suddenly noticed that the name of the magic card had actually changed. What's going on? He saw the words written on the card. Primordial Dragon Egg. He was not unfamiliar with this change. After the magic elves evolved, after the single scabbard transformed into a weapon form, their magic card would also change its name. Moreover, the attributes, ultimate skills and other information would also change accordingly. Could it be? Dake raised his eyebrows and suddenly noticed that after this magic card became Primordial Dragon Egg, it actually changed from 6 stars to 3 stars. This kind of reduction in star level. Of course, it was not a bad thing. 6-star magic elves needed to be sacrificed to quickly summon, but there was no need for this at all for 3 stars. From the 2nd tier to the 1st tier, it meant that this Primordial Dragon Egg could be directly summoned using ordinary summoning spells. If after summoning, it could smoothly hatch into a young green-eyed dragon, then it could be used as a special summoning method. In addition, this Primordial Dragon Egg and young green-eyed dragon might have different ultimate skills. Dake immediately injected magic to check it out. As expected, the feedback from the magic card was indeed different. Card name, Primordial Dragon Egg. Type, Elven card. Level, *****. Race, Dragon. Attribute, Light. Magic power, 1500. Attack, 0 defense, 1500. Ultimate skill, Hatch. There's actually only one ultimate skill? And it's only Hatch? The surprise from just now suddenly disappeared, and Dake's eyebrows gradually deepened. This Primordial Dragon Egg was nothing special in terms of its 3 attributes. A 3-star max MP and defense could only be said to be passable, and a 0-point attack was more or less within expectations. But this Surekill skill actually only had 1 hatch. From the name, this hatch seemed to be an ultimate skill that could hatch the Primordial Dragon Egg into a young green-eyed dragon. In order to understand the time needed for this hatch, Dake further injected magic to further understand. But immediately, the wrinkles between his eyebrows suddenly relaxed, and he could not hide the joy on his face. Unexpectedly, this incubation was a Surekill skill with extremely deep meaning. Hatch. The Primordial Dragon Egg has unlimited possibilities before hatching. Currently unlocked conventional hatching route. Young green-eyed dragon. Hatching route 1. As long as enough magic is injected, the Primordial Dragon Egg can be hatched into a young green-eyed dragon. This means that the egg is the main body. It seems that my previous feeling was not wrong. Dake suddenly woke up and then suddenly had an idea. He took out a Pride 3 card from his card pack and summoned it on the spot. In the name of Dake Dimung, magic summoning. At that moment, a dark golden light erupted from the Pride 3 card surface, illuminating the field of vision. The dragon egg that was reflected in the light of the Pride reflected a bright golden light. A huge Pride emblem quietly emerged from the eggshell, and the surrounding light was absorbed by this Pride emblem and was injected into the dragon egg. The Primordial Dragon Egg that had unlimited possibilities gradually exuded an arrogant aura. Dake's expression was focused as he carefully observed the changes in the dragon egg. As the light of Pride 3 faded, the dragon egg's eggshell finally cracked open, and a young green-eyed dragon, with dark golden stripes on its body, hatched from within. Dake immediately checked the magic card, and found that this magic card had changed from Primordial Dragon Egg to Sin, Young Green-Eyed Dragon. The Sin, Young Green-Eyed Dragon, was obviously a subspecies of the Young Green-Eyed Dragon. Other than the dark golden stripes on its body and the Pride emblem on the inner side of its wings, it was exactly the same as the Young Green-Eyed Dragon. And its race, attributes, and 3 measurements were exactly the same as well. Card name: Sin, Young Green-Eyed Dragon. Type, Elven card. Level, Race, Dragon. Attribute, Light. Magic, 2500. Attack, 3000. Defense, 2500. Ultimate skill, Dragon Egg Transformation, Call of the Young Dragon, Dragon's Reverse Scale, World of Sin. For ultimate skills, only the last one is different from the ultimate skill of the Young Green-Eyed Dragon. The original Light Morning Hall has become World of Sin. But since it is a Sin dragon that was hatched using Pride 3, then World of Sin should be a venue card related to great sins. Dark once again poured his mana in, trying to obtain more information about this Surekill skill. Sin World. Sin. The young green-eyed dragon can summon the descent of the Sin world. When a magic elf with the power of original sin dies in the Sin world, the remaining power of original sin will be absorbed by the Sin world. It can be used as a sacrifice to summon a magic elf with the same power of original sin as the dead magic elf. World of Sin lasts for 3 minutes. A special type of venue card. If I use World of Sin in battle, I can ignore the sacrifice rules and continuously summon magic elves that meet the requirements. Without a doubt, this is a more suitable venue card for me than Light Morning Hall. Dake gradually understood. This World of Sin should be the same as Call of the Young Dragon. It is a type that can directly summon magic elves from the deck. However, magic elves like Curse Cage, Little Evil Beast, and Fantasy Beast, Ibu, that have nothing to do with great sins in the initial state shouldn't be able to use this mechanism to summon them. No matter what, this is indeed a killer move that can be used as the core of a duel. However, it's best to have multiple magic elf cards with the same power of original sin to complement it. Dark reached out his hand and touched the scales of the sin green-eyed baby dragon. While he had some understanding of it, he also had a clearer understanding of the egg incubation, sure kill skill of the original dragon egg magic card. Young green-eyed dragon and sin? Young green-eyed dragon can be seen as the lower forms of young green-eyed white dragon and sin? Young green-eyed white dragon. Since original dragon egg has unlimited possibilities, then as long as I find the incubation formula, I should be able to unlock the young green-eyed white dragon and sin? Young green-eyed white dragon. And even more, young green-eyed subspecies incubation routes. Among them, young green-eyed dragon belongs to the conventional incubation route. It only needs to be injected with enough magic to hatch it. Based on this, its higher form, young green-eyed white dragon, should need to be injected with a higher quality of magic to hatch it. And sin? Young green-eyed dragon was hatched using Pride 3. Then its higher form sin? Young green-eyed white dragon should need Pride or Pride to hatch it. Among them, Pride is more likely. Other than that, I can also try other Great Sins cards to see if I can unlock new incubation routes. Anyway, let's see how long the cooldown of Dragon Egg Transformation is. Dragon Egg Transformation was obviously not the same as weapon form of single scabbard. Its cooldown was very long, but it was still shorter than Dake expected. It was only about an hour. When the cooldown was over, Dark turned the sin green-eyed baby dragon back into the primordial dragon egg. Then he used Bliss 3, Greed 3, and Bliss 3, Moon to experiment with it. However, other than Pride 3, the other Great Sins 3 could not prompt original dragon egg to hatch. Is it because the attributes are wrong? Dake could not help but fall into deep thought. The green-eyed white dragon is essentially of the light attribute. Only some special subspecies have other attributes, but there are still other attributes. Or is it still because the energy level is not enough? After all, the subspecies of the green-eyed white dragon are basically 8-star and above. Like the two types of green-eyed young dragons that have hatched so far, there are limitations. Forget it, after all, because there is no higher level Great Sins card, I can't carry out further research. This time when I go back home for the long vacation, I must find a way to research Great Sins, to create a template for Great Sins. Dake could only temporarily put down his research when he could not come to a conclusion after thinking for a long time. When he came back to his senses, the time was already close to 5 o'clock. I'm already so late in a daze? Dake could not help but pat his cheeks as he started to tidy up the experiment table. The magic elf card that he had refined this afternoon might not be that strong in terms of practicality at the moment, but there was no doubt that it had greatly expanded his card set system. He could only say that the future is promising. Moreover, from an experimental point of view, the primordial dragon egg had another special meaning. Through various experiments, various green-eyed subspecies could be hatched, and then these green-eyed subspecies could be used as the basis for research. From there, more magic elf cards of green-eyed subspecies could be refined. This could be said to be a kind of chicken comes first, egg comes later train of thought. If he could go through this train of thought, sooner or later, he would be able to construct a powerful green-eyed card set. By then, he might even be able to compete with Panduola for the title of White Dragon King. Therefore, overall, Dake was still very satisfied. He recorded the experiment this time, and prepared to come back at night to refine the next, Bliss 3, month. As for the green-eyed young dragon that had just been refined, it could only continue to stay in the magic card. On the first Wednesday of the last month of the first year, Professor Midya moved the teaching equipment that had been prepared in advance into the carriage, preparing to give the cute students some small surprises tonight. The students had already known that there would be a final topic for the astronomy class tonight, so they were all prepared. Before 7 o'clock, they all went up the spiral clock tower one after another to discuss the final topic in the classroom. I heard that starting from the second year, astronomy will be listed as an elective and can be officially taken as an elective. I wonder if Professor Midya will still stay on? Dake said to Deanna and Luo C as he stroked Ivan. 2 and 1 4/100 plus. Chapter 439. But how could Deanna and Luosi know about Professor Midya's intentions? The two shook their heads slightly. Deanna muttered, I hope Professor Midya's final project won't be too difficult. Luosi whispered, it shouldn't be too difficult. After all, astronomy is just a hobby class. You two shouldn't be too relaxed. Dake shook his head. Professor Midya isn't the kind of professor who would go easy on others. Also, she seems to have said that this time's astronomy assessment will also be recorded in the final grade. Deanna suddenly exclaimed, huh? Did she say that? Luosi's face also slightly collapsed. He hesitated and said, it seems like I have a little impression of it. Just as the students were having a heated discussion, the clock struck 7:30 in the evening. The class bell rang. This time, Professor Midya arrived on time. She still rode the pumpkin carriage and flew into the classroom through the open ceiling. However, Blood Maiden, who always secretly followed her to the classroom, was still in confinement. Midya Bartholomew, who walked into the church alone, picked up her magic wand and gently pointed it at the carriage. Then, a head-sized crystal ball flew out of the carriage out of thin air. She waved her hand again, and a total of 12 crystal balls flew in front of her in an orderly manner. Remember the website, MVIP can't you? 6. When the students were puzzled, Professor Midya narrowed her eyes and smiled. In the blink of an eye, it's the end of the semester. During my time at the Shungmalian Academy, I got along very well with everyone. But including tonight, there are only 4 astronomy classes left in this semester. I know a lot of people don't want to face it, but what will come will come. Today, I will assign the final project of the semester. I hope you can complete it and submit it to me within a month. Because this was something that had already been revealed, the students weren't surprised. Professor Midya turned around and wrote the word constellation on the blackboard. She said, tonight's project is constellation. In the previous class, I briefly talked about constellation, but I didn't go in depth. The movement of the sun, moon, and stars in the universe affects the prosperity and decline of all things, even the fate of people. Horoscopes and astrology have always been closely related. We all know that everyone is born with a corresponding constellation, which is commonly known as the 12 zodiac signs: Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Centaur, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. The constellation that we usually talk about is chosen from the 12 zodiac signs according to the time of birth. As the main constellations, these 12 constellations are the most well-known. However, in reality, there are a total of 88 constellations in the universe. In recent years, more and more astrologers have discovered that the constellations of the 12 zodiac signs can only express a person's fate on the surface. If they want to truly study a person's fate, they have to start from a broader point of view. In other words, they have to study those 88 constellations. Astrologers define the 12 constellations corresponding to each person's birth as the outer constellations, and the wider 88 constellations as the inner constellations. And our final topic for this semester will be these 88 constellations. You have to find your own inner constellation and use it to make a prophecy for the holidays. Professor Midya raised her wand and gently tapped the 12 crystal balls in front of her. Suddenly, the 12 crystal balls began to split. When the splitting ended, there were a total of 88 crystal balls floating in the air. She raised her hand and the 88 crystal balls flew up. Then they scattered and gathered together like stars to form a huge star chart. Ai Ma, who was sitting in the front row, raised her hand at this moment. Professor Midya asked, "Do you have any questions, Métis?" Ai Ma stood up as usual and said, "Professor, what should we do to find our own inner constellation?" Professor Midya saw that she was so cooperative and said with a smile, "There are many ways to determine one's inner constellation. Even every astrologer has their own method, and the results obtained will be different. I usually like to create a star palace maze, and let people find their own inner constellation through their own hearts. This is also something we need to touch on in this class." Star palace maze? Ai Ma asked curiously. Is it a type of illusion? Professor Midya waved her hand and gestured for her to sit down. Then she continued, "Your guess is correct, but it is closer to a dream. When people enter a dream, Their inner and outer personality will be separated, and they will follow their heart more closely. The dream will guide you to find your own inner constellation. Tonight, we have 90 minutes. I will use 30 minutes to explain some basic knowledge to you. After that, I will give you 60 minutes to find your own inner constellation in the Star Palace maze. I hope this trip to the Star Palace maze will not only help you find your inner constellation, but also help you foresee your destiny in the next few months. Professor Midya's words were not impassioned, but her simple explanation attracted the attention of the students who couldn't help but immerse themselves in it. Their curiosity towards the secrets of the inner constellation and the Star Palace maze realm made them interested. Dake's heart was also filled with curiosity. He knew about the existence of the 88 constellations from the very beginning, but the outer constellation and inner constellation were clearly definitions that only existed in this world. According to Professor Midya's explanation, the outer constellation is only the outer constellation. The inner constellation is the true fate. Let me calculate. I was born on the 6th of June. On the surface, I belong to the Gemini constellation of the 12 zodiac signs, but the inner constellation, Pegasus Meteor Fist? As long as it's not Cancer. Dake poked Abusa's little nose and said, I wonder what your inner constellation is. Abusa twisted his head, indicating that he wanted to pay attention. Half an hour later, Professor Midya finished her lecture on basic knowledge. She pointed her finger, and the 88 crystal balls flew around the classroom. Under her control, each crystal ball spun and emitted a nebula-like starlight. They connected to form an extremely complex array. Professor Midya glanced at the expectant students below the stage, and the corners of her lips curled up slightly. She said, Relax your spirit and don't resist. Next, I'll bring you all into the Star Palace maze realm, and step into the Star Palace. Her voice gradually became lighter, and a special chanting sound came out of her mouth, accompanied by a surge of magic power that spread throughout the classroom. In the center of the 88 crystal balls, a constellation pattern gradually lit up. From the center of the array, a nebula-like glow was emitted. The entire array began to spin, and turned into a deep starry sky. The little magisters in the classroom felt as if they were under the starry sky. Their spirit gradually emptied and their eyes slowly closed. Abusa turned around and looked at his master, who had already closed his eyes. He followed suit and lay on the table and closed his eyes. Starlight sprinkled down from the starry sky, enveloping it as well. A mysterious energy fluctuation was emitted. The consciousness of everyone present, except for Professor Midya, was drawn into a dreamlike world. Dake felt his spirit being cleansed. His whole body became light and floaty. When he opened his eyes again, he was already in another place. Is this the Star Palace maze? He suddenly came back to his senses and noticed that he was in a world filled with mirrors. The whole world seemed to have been cut into countless pieces. From the shattered mirrors, a rainbow light was reflected. Red, green, yellow. Countless colors blended together and rushed into his brain with great impact. Dake spent about half a minute to let his eyes get used to the shattered world and the countless colors. Then, he lowered his head and looked at himself. He discovered that he had turned into a fluffy individual in this world. It can't be right? This shocking fact didn't make Dake feel frightened. He just couldn't help but have black lines appear on his forehead. He carefully looked at his own hands and feet. Even though he was still standing upright, his arms and legs had become extremely short. His raised palms hid pink and tender pads that made people want to rub their cheeks against them. Did I turn into a cat or a dog? Dake tried to walk 2 steps. He discovered that his 4 limbs were uncoordinated. He walked crookedly and couldn't control himself. He quickly accepted this setting. Then he found a mirror that could reflect his figure. Finally, he saw his full appearance. The young man in the mirror had turned into a golden-furred short-legged cat. He blinked at the mirror, and his dark green cat eyes glowed. I actually turned into a cat? Professor Midya, who was sitting behind the podium, looked at the cute cat on the table, and couldn't help but cover her mouth and laugh. The normal Star Palace maze didn't have a setting that would turn people into small animals. But if it was normal, wouldn't it be boring? looking at the little magicians who usually acted like little adults turning into cute little animals, and running around in the maze was really fun. Professor Midya's gaze turned, and the projection on the table switched to other people. Deanna turned into a white bear. Luosi turned into a pink rabbit. Aima turned into a big-teethed otter. Luoboat turned into a long-haired dog. White turned into a round-headed deer. Every little magician who entered the Star Palace maze was trying hard to move their short legs. Their swaying appearance was comical and cute. Wait. Suddenly her eyebrows twitched. She discovered an anomaly. There was a 2 to 3-year-old brown-haired cutie. It was staggering forward in the maze. Little Ivan looked at himself in the mirror. He raised his chubby little hands in front of him and looked at them repeatedly. After a long while, he accepted the fact that he had turned into a human. At the same time that all the humans had turned into small animals, the only small animal that entered the Star Palace maze had turned into a human. It blinked and tried hard to adapt to the feeling of walking upright. Then, with a blank expression, it looked for a path in this illusory world. This journey in the Star Palace maze was only 60 minutes. If it still couldn't find a constellation that belonged to it in these 60 minutes, then it could only rely on its own imagination for the big topic at the end of the semester. Of course, it was impossible to get a high score by doing this. However, astronomy was an interest class in nature. There was no such thing as failing. Next year, there was no need to worry about being forced to make up for it. At most, the score would be lower and it would look worse on paper. If it was Ivan, there was even less to worry about. However, its desire to get a high score was no lower than any other student. As the only magic guiding sprite under Dake's command that could follow him to class, although it didn't say it, it had always been proud of it in its heart. Every Wednesday night's astronomy class was the time that it looked forward to the most. Although learning was very difficult, it was very serious and diligent. And no matter who it was, after putting in more effort than others, of course, they would want to receive an equivalent reward, as well as praise from the people they cared about. Ibu-chan thought this way. Apart from that, it also hoped that through this method of showing results, Dake could continue to take astronomy as an elective in his second year. After searching for 5 or 6 minutes in the Star Palace maze, Ivan suddenly stopped in front of a mirror. It had a mysterious feeling that it was attracted to this mirror. It couldn't help but reach out to touch it, and then it was sucked in by the mirror. The world changed. After observing for a long time, Dake Dimming also reached his hand into one of the mirrors. His hand passed through without any resistance, and he immediately understood that every mirror here was a door to another place. He didn't hesitate too much. Shaking his fluffy body, he stepped into the mirror in front of him. After passing through the mirror, the scenery in his field of vision completely changed. Compared to when he first entered, a world with fewer broken mirrors and colors appeared in front of him. Dake turned around and found that the mirror he had just passed through had disappeared without a trace. He didn't panic. After circling the surroundings twice, he chose another mirror and stepped into it. After going through it a few times, he finally found that there were fewer and fewer cracks in the world in front of him, and the rainbow colors that filled the screen were also gradually disappearing. The world became more and more monotonous because of this, and the paths in front of him became fewer and fewer. In the end, there was only one path that led straight to the end. He didn't hesitate to walk into this path that didn't have any forks in the road, and followed the winding path forward. He didn't know how long he had walked. Walls quietly erected on both sides of the path, and then the walls became transparent, becoming smooth mirrors at some point. When he turned around, countless reflections of himself were reflected in the mirror. A trace of fear suddenly appeared in his heart. Dake turned around abruptly, and only the front remained in his eyes. He couldn't be sure if the other students' journeys were the same as his own, but when he turned around and looked directly at the mirror, he really did feel a kind of endless terror, as if countless world lines of himself were moving forward at the same time. Only those who saw fate could feel the terror of fate. 2 in 1 4000 plus. Chapter 440. This is Midya Bartholomew had been excitedly observing the students' behavior in the Star Palace maze realm when she suddenly noticed a strange fluctuation in the last row of the classroom. Dake Dimming was immersed in the Star Palace maze realm. His expression didn't change in the slightest, but the atmosphere around him was clearly different. As an experienced clairvoyant, Professor Midya was able to confirm that this was the aura of a divine innate gift. The so-called divine innate gift was a gift. Naturally, it was something one was born with. It was just that some people were born with knowledge, while others were late bloomers. Examples of people who awaken later could be found everywhere. Awakening later didn't mean it was born later. After all, having it was having it, and not having it was not having it. People without it, no matter how much they dug, wouldn't appear. People who were late bloomers were only born with a divine innate gift that had been buried deep in the past. Professor Midya immediately realized that Dake's divine innate gift had finally revealed itself. Remember in a second. https://m. VIP can't you? VIP, but was it really like that? All this time, there was a close relationship between a magister and the magister sprite they personally refined. It was as close as a pair of hands and feet. Thus, in certain spellcasting concepts, a magister magus and his magister sprite were considered to be the same entity. Dake's understanding of this was actually quite profound. But what if it continued like this? Since Ivan, as one of the magister magus's divine innate gift, then wouldn't he also be considered to have a divine innate gift? This was actually a very simple logical question. While Dake's character was influencing the magister sprites, he was also being assimilated by them. And with this trip to the Star Palace maze realm as an opportunity, Ivan's divine innate gift had finally quietly blossomed and bore fruit. As Dake walked through the mirror passage, the feeling of the unseen world became even more profound after his divine innate gift blossomed and bore fruit. And as he changed, the passage sandwiched between the mirrors also changed accordingly. He suddenly stopped moving forward. The mirrors on both sides no longer reflected his figure. Instead, a snake-like constellation appeared on the mirrors and extended forward. Hydra constellation? Professor Midya, who was paying attention to Dake because of his strange behavior, couldn't help but frown at the constellation. Hydra constellation was the longest and largest constellation among the 88 constellations. If this was Dake's constellation, just as she was thinking about this, Dake moved forward again. Not long after, when he stopped again, the mirrors on both sides of his body reflected another constellation. It was the Gemini constellation. The Gemini constellation, as the dark star constellation, always symbolized the twin Gemini with two sides. But after the previous experience, Dark did his best to recognize the appearance of Gemini constellation, and quickly continued to move forward. Not long after, he encountered a new constellation and continued. When he finally walked through the passageway, not a single one of the 88 constellations remained. All of them were reflected in the mirror of the passageway. Professor Midya, who was already numb halfway through, turned to pay attention to the other students. It wasn't until he walked through the entire corridor that he finally regained his attention. After that, she saw Dake walk out of the passageway and enter a circular palace. The palace's ceiling was a hemispherical structure. When one raised their head, they could see a complex starry sky carved on the ceiling. All of the planets belonging to the 88 constellations were all listed on it. What a vast star map it was. Just by looking up at him, one would feel that they were insignificant. The golden-furred, blue-eyed, short-legged cat wobbled its way to the center of the palace. It raised its head and looked at the 88 constellations above its head with a puzzled expression. What the hell? His goal was to complete the task and find his own constellation in the Star Palace maze realm. He didn't want to see all of the 88 constellations. This kind of situation was meaningless to him. However, after Professor Midya confirmed this scene, she had a look of expectation. It seems that my intuition was not wrong. Dake Dimming is the constellation. From the first time she saw Dake, Professor Midya believed that Dake was the son of the constellation. Now, it seemed that she had received further confirmation. The reason why she was invited to become a professor was to decipher a prophecy related to the constellation, the Black Fog, and the Abyss. Therefore, she had paid special attention to Dake for a long time. And this time, it only strengthened her belief. However, just as Dake was confused by the 88 constellations, a mirror door suddenly opened on one side of the palace. Then, a brown-haired little cutie wobbled out of it. Under the guidance of a mysterious feeling, Earbook also entered the palace. When it saw the short-legged cat, it sniffed fiercely. Then its eyes lit up and it wobbled over. While Dake was wondering why there was a human child in the Star Palace maze realm, Earbook had already arrived in front of it. The short-limbed golden kitten and the 2- or 3-year-old child hugged each other. Squeak, squeak. The surprised cry immediately betrayed Earbook's identity. Dake curiously stroked its hair. He had a better understanding of the wonders of the Star Palace maze realm. The journey in the Star Palace maze realm was not over. After Dake recognized Earbook, he held its hand and entered through a side door in the corner of the palace. Then he entered the mirror in the side door and continued forward. He would not stop until he found the constellation that belonged to him. Boom! A blazing flame suddenly rose from under his feet. Although it did not burn him, he could feel the heat. He subconsciously lifted his foot. The flame suddenly exploded. The surging flame attacked the surroundings, turning into a sea of fire. Crack! The world he was in seemed to be burned by the fire. Cracks appeared in the void and spread wider and wider. The entire world was completely shattered in Dake's eyes. Pieces of color rushed out from the cracks and instantly filled his vision. The world that was gradually becoming monotonous was once again polluted by the light. Fragments that covered the sky and earth smashed down from above, as if they wanted to completely destroy the already shattered world. Dong! The 9 o'clock bell suddenly rang. Dake suddenly opened his eyes and saw Earbook lying on the table. At the same time, all the students in the classroom opened their eyes at the same time. Then their originally motionless expressions suddenly became rich one by one. Some of their faces were distorted with fear. Some of their faces were smiling. Some of their faces were filled with sadness. There were even more people who were loudly discussing the constellations that they had found. In an instant, the classroom was filled with noisy discussions. Dake, what's your constellation? Deanna in the front row quietly turned her head. Her big eyes were shining. Dake did not need to ask to know that Deanna's constellation was either Ursa Major or Ursa Minor. In short, she would be very satisfied. But the excitement between people could not be shared. There was no way to communicate between those who had found their constellation and those who had not. Dake thought back to the last scene he saw before leaving the Star Palace maze realm. He slightly shook his head. I'm still not sure. Deanna curiously asked. Is that so? Dake then asked. Then what about yours? Is it Ursa Minor? Deanna excitedly said. It's Ursa Major. Clap, clap, clap. Professor Midya gently clapped her hands, and the 88 crystal balls scattered all over the classroom stopped spinning. They quickly flew in her direction and arranged themselves around her like stars in the sky. The students in the classroom were attracted by this scene and stopped their discussions. Professor Midya's figure under the starlight was extra mysterious. She lightly smiled. The Star Palace maze realm can reflect one's self. Whether or not you will come into contact with astrology in the future, learning how to see yourself is very important. Alright, today's class ends here. I suggest that when you go back, you should quickly record down everything you see and hear in the Star Palace maze realm. Then, before the 27th of this month, you should hand in your homework. This will be the last big topic for your first-year astronomy class, and will be included in your final grade. She then slightly waved her hand, and the 88 crystal balls reformed into 12. Then from 12, they combined into one with stars shining inside. There are 3 more classes until the end of the semester. If there is anything you don't understand, you can ask me during these 3 classes. I hope that you will pay enough attention to this final assignment. Class is now over. After Professor Midya announced the end of the class, the students left the classroom one after another. All kinds of discussions were echoing under the night sky. Dake placed little Earbook on his shoulder and followed the crowd down the stairs. However, he couldn't help but reveal a worried expression. His expression was similar to Earbook's. This was not only because they were unable to find their own constellation in the Star Palace maze realm, but also because of the scene of destruction they saw before leaving the Star Palace maze realm. Living in the maze created by astrology, anything seen would not come out of nowhere. Furthermore, he had Ibu, who had the gift of divination, by his side. That scene of destruction was definitely foreshadowing something. Dake didn't know that he already had the gift of divination, but that didn't stop him from paying attention to that scene. According to Professor Midya's assignment, he needed to find his own constellation and make a prophecy for the next few months. In short, regardless of whether the prophecy was true or false, he had to write something. After returning to the dormitory from the spiral clock tower, Dake immediately recorded everything he saw in the Star Palace maze realm. Ibu, who was already used to holding a pen with his claws, was also writing with all his might. Although he used many phonetic symbols to replace rare words in his little notebook, the content was still quite smooth. After Dake finished his own notes, he looked at Ibu's notes. From the moment he entered the Star Palace maze realm, Ibu followed his intuition and shuttled back and forth between the mirrors. He was different from Dake. Along the way, he met many students, but because those students all had the appearance of small animals and walked upright, he felt that they were very unfamiliar. Therefore, he timidly avoided them until he met a four-legged little fox. Only then did he subconsciously follow it. He followed the little fox and had many wonderful encounters. Compared to Dake's monotonous journey, it was much more interesting. Just like that, it walked and stopped for dozens of minutes. When it was finally about to catch the little fox, it bumped into a mirror and entered the palace. After that, everything he saw and heard was completely the same as Dake's. So it seems that your constellation should be Fox. Ibu tilted his head and thought for a bit. Then he nodded and finally revealed a relaxed expression. After confirming his constellation, he could look up information, analyze the constellation, and then try to make a prophecy. In short, he had to get a high score for the astronomy class's final exam. Ibuzachan's seriousness was very infectious. Even the playful Miss Vampire started reading in her little notebook, which was a rare sight. Dake looked at the vampire's daughter, who was seriously reading, and thought, out of all his magic guide fairies, only this one was completely in human form. After a long period of learning, the vampire's daughter gradually learned how to speak. Although she looked like she was only 7 or 8 years old, there were many young girls in the Shungmalian Academy. If possible, maybe I should let her enter with the first year next semester? After having this idea, Dake couldn't help but think. A human form magic guide fairy and a beast form magic guide fairy gave off a different feeling. If possible, he still wanted to give her a better education. Moreover, she had the qualifications to do so. It was just that it wasn't easy to enter the Shungmalian Academy. The students of the Shungmalian Academy, other than the ones who were actively recruited by the school, had to go through an application process. Parents and elders had to submit an application, and then pass the entrance test. After paying a certain amount of tuition, they could successfully enter the academy. Simply put, they had to face the entrance test. Dake himself received an invitation and was actively recruited, so he didn't go through the entrance test, and didn't know the difficulty of the entrance test. Therefore, he had this layer of concern. He didn't have much confidence in the vampire's daughter being able to enter the academy. If the front door doesn't work, then I can only go through the back door. That night, Dake didn't make much progress in his astronomy class. However, he extracted a drop of greed, and successfully refined the second improved version of Bliss 3 Moon. With this, he had 2 improved versions of Bliss 3 Moon in his hands. The uncontrolled Bliss 3 Moon could finally be retired. As May came, everyone gradually became busy. Chapter 441. Whether it was the students or the professors, they were all in a hurry. The first grade students were preparing for the final exam, the 2nd to 6th grade students were preparing for the final exam, and the 6th grade students were also busy preparing for graduation. The originally relaxed atmosphere of the school became more and more intense. Even Dake had to postpone the research on great sins until next month. As for this month, he would try to save as many great sins as possible and save them for later use. In addition, he still had a semi-finished transformation spell in his hand, but he really didn't have time to study it. Professor Kazir was obviously getting busier and busier, so he didn't want to disturb him. However, when he thought about it, the long holiday was 3 months long, so he could continue the research after the holiday. Anyway, it was unlikely that he would go out after returning home, so he could find something to do. After making up his mind, Dake focused his attention on the final exam, especially the research on astronomy. This was probably the first research project he had encountered since he entered the school that he didn't know where to start. As long as he saw a few constellations in the star palace, he could find a way to analyze the differences and find the most suitable constellation for himself. Even if it wasn't accurate, at least there was a research point. Website: https://m.vipcanshu. VIP. But who would have thought that he would see all 88 constellations in the star palace? This pointless question bothered him for a whole week. It wasn't until Wednesday of the second week of May that he finally gave up and asked Professor Midya a question. The look in Professor Midya's eyes left a deep impression on him. After knowing the answer, he couldn't help but ask, "Can there be more than one constellation?" Professor Midya just said, "Of course not, but there are always people in this world who are extraordinary, such as you." Dake couldn't help but smile awkwardly. No one knew how extraordinary he was more than himself, but wasn't there something wrong with that? What was the use of having 88 constellations? Writing 88 theses? That's your own problem. Professor Midya held back her laughter. Anyway, the project has been assigned. How you do it is your own business. I'm only responsible for grading. Dake. Therefore, Dake was forced to organize all the information of the 88 constellations and write an extremely long analysis. Based on the final scene of destruction he saw in the Star Palace maze, he tried to make a prophecy interpretation. But when it came to interpretation of the prophecy, it was actually just a vague prediction of recent encounters. The flames that shot out from his feet indicated that he was about to step into danger, and the flames represented that he would encounter a fire-related disaster. Basically, it was a prophecy interpretation of this level, and after deciphering it, he naturally had to find a way to deal with it. Generally speaking, water overpowers fire. Therefore, in order to deal with fire, one had to look for water-type items. Dake had indeed written this in his homework. But what he really thought was, wouldn't it be fine if I didn't go out? Anyway, he wasn't going to go out, was he? Therefore, Dake did not pay too much attention to it. It was already the third week of May when he finally finished his astronomy class's final project. In the past 2 weeks, he had extracted another 6 drops of pride and 6 drops of greed. The remaining 5 points of pride and 5 points of greed were all stored in the insect tree. And then on Thursday afternoon of the third week, the History of Magic class was finally assigned a final topic. As one of the major courses, the History of Magic class had always been a combination of a theoretical exam and a written oral defense. But every professor had their own ideas. Professor Ryan Hux thought that the History of Magic theory exam was not very meaningful, and changed it to an open book thesis, which was the same model as the astronomy class. He gave a total of 8 topics for the students to choose. But in fact, the difficulty of each topic was not low, and they were all dry and boring. There was really nothing interesting about it, which made the first-year little magisters wail. After all, the History of Magic was a major course, and was different from the astronomy class, which was a hobby course. If the score of this course was not up to standard, they would face failure, make up exams, and even tutoring. If they failed many courses, and even faced the possibility of repeating a year, that would be the end of them. Therefore, although the first-year students were wailing in their hearts, they still worked hard to find information and complete the topic. Dake was the same. These days after class, he basically spent his spare time in the library and the dormitory, becoming busier and busier. Apart from the History of Magic, the assessment methods for the other courses were also announced during class. Among them, summoning, introduction to magic, potioneering, and dueling were all theoretical and practical exams. Only arithmetic and magical beasts only had theoretical and written exams. Magical beasts had lower requirements, and was also a hobby course for the time being. All the practical exams would be held in the fourth week of May, and the theoretical and written exams would start on the 28th. In short, theses, experiments, and revision filled the entire month of May to the brim for the students. As a result, the first-year students' attention to the school championship competition decreased by a lot. Many of them were immersed in their studies when they suddenly realized that the inter-house competition was about to begin. Although the first-year students could not participate in the inter-house competition, the collective sense of honor passed down from a long history still made them deeply immersed in it. The atmosphere between the students of different branches became much worse because of this. From 8 o'clock Friday night to 8 o'clock Sunday night, a duration of 48 hours. From the 2nd to 6th years, each branch will select 3 students from each year to form a team and enter the dungeon for an adventure. The final score will be calculated based on the actions of each team. Before the competition starts, the school will release a few missions with high points. If you can finish the mission first, you will be able to obtain high points. In addition, there will be additional points for crusading against level boss and exploring unknown areas. There will be a weighting factor for the lower grades compared to the higher grades. Therefore, in the Dungeons Adventure competition, the higher grades may not necessarily be able to suppress the lower grades. It's a pity that the Dungeons Adventure competition is not broadcasted live. We can only estimate the situation based on the changes in the points of each branch. Dake put down the rules book and continued to immerse himself in his revision. He was not interested in other people's dungeon adventures. This time next year, it would be his stage. It was not until 7 o'clock Sunday night that he temporarily put down his pen and paper and left the dormitory for the common lounge. At this time, the common lounge was already filled with people. The students from the aristocrat house were gathered here, fiercely discussing the changes in points. In the last hour, there were 4 colleges, 5 grades, and 20 adventurer teams in the dungeon. Every college's temporary accumulated points were increasing at a rapid pace. Dake found the seats of the first years and sat down beside Doran. He asked, "How is it? Who has the advantage?" Doran was so excited that his cheeks were red. He immediately said, "Of course, the aristocrat house has the advantage." But the little fatty beside him, Pitan, was clearly nervous. Little Excellent is in the lead, but it can be overtaken at any time. This year's Magician House is very strong. Dake took out his branch card and opened the bar chart. As expected, the temporary points of the aristocrat house were only slightly higher than the Magician House. Moreover, the temporary points of the Knight House and the Fool House were also close behind. The overall strength of the 4 branches was not as great as expected. The contestants from each year were all top students, so there was no difference in strength. "There's still half an hour before the critical period, right?" Dake said after thinking for a moment. Pitan immediately nodded. "Yes, in half an hour, the strongest mission boss of this dungeon tournament will appear. Whoever can find and defeat the boss in half an hour will most likely be in the lead. Even the Fool House, which has the lowest temporary points, will have an instant chance of becoming the champion. The strongest mission boss. I'm afraid that even if the 2nd and 3rd years found it, they would have a hard time defeating it." Dake lowered his head to look at his branch card again. Suddenly his eyelids twitched. Did the Fool House complete a mission with high points? Almost at the same time, the common lounge was filled with a series of exclamations. The bar chart representing the Fool House had suddenly increased by a large margin, causing the school with the lowest temporary points to jump to the highest. Dake turned his head slightly and saw that the excited Doran was now slamming the table with force. He looked very much like a pitiful person who had suddenly had the upper hand. Little fatty Pitan hurriedly lifted the table and comforted him. "Don't panic, Doran. We still have a chance. Yes, we won't give up until the very end. We won't give up until the very end." Doran clenched his fists and repeatedly muttered to himself before calming down. Dake observed again, and found that many people were as excited as Doran. He couldn't help but think, why do these people seem to value the school championship more than I do? He valued the school championship because of his need for the Holy Grail. But these students seem to be purely motivated by the so-called honor of the aristocrat house? Just as Dake was analyzing the psychology of the students, the bar chart on the branch card changed dramatically again. The Knight House, the Magical Device House, and even the second-ranked Aristocrat House seemed to have suddenly completed a mission with high points, causing their temporary points to skyrocket. Half an hour before the start of the dungeon tournament, the increase in the dungeon tournament slowed down. According to the predictions of the upperclassmen, this was most likely because the upperclassmen of the four houses had discovered the strongest boss at the same time. How many points does this mission boss give? Dake couldn't help but ask. Piston immediately took a look at the information beside him, then raised his head and said, 100,000 points. 100,000 points? Dake pondered. I remember that in the school championship tournament, every victory is worth 10,000 points? Piston nodded and said, it's like this. The tournament uses the branch competition model. First, it's a battle between the different grades, then it's a cross-grade battle. Each grade can only send out one person, and everyone has one chance to challenge a cross-grade battle. Every victory earns 10,000 points, and the higher grade wins 10,000 points. The school with the highest score earns an additional 100,000 points as the winning prize. In other words, these 100,000 points can offset the winning prize at the end of the tournament. Dake couldn't help but narrow his eyes. Because these were temporary points, these tens of thousands of temporary points were meaningless no matter how many there were. The main thing was the difference. A difference of 100,000 points could determine the winner. And once the strongest mission boss of the dungeon tournament and the winner of the tournament were obtained by two different schools, then to determine the winner, they would have to rely on the accumulation of other points. At this time, the actual total points and the temporary points from the final exam would have a sense of existence. After that, the atmosphere became very anxious. The students in the common lounge stared at the column chart of their school cards, waiting for the final results to appear. When there were only 2 minutes left to 8 o'clock, the temporary point column of the Sorcerer School suddenly jumped up. Instantly, the whole audience wailed. It's over, this year's Holy Grail is over. Why is it the Sorcerer School? Why is it the Sorcerer School? Quickly calculate the difference in points. The screams of the students rose and fell, and there were sounds of tables being slammed and watermelons being slammed and carrots being slammed. Beside the ashen-faced Doran, Dake immediately calculated the difference in points and finally heaved a sigh of relief. The slight advantage that the Aristocrat House had established at the beginning was in effect. The difference in points between the two schools was still less than 100,000. This meant that as long as they won the tournament, the Aristocrat House had a high chance of winning the school championship tournament. This meant that there was still a chance. A chance was better than no chance at all. The atmosphere in the room gradually calmed down. The lower grade students discussed animatedly. The upper grade students were like deflated balloons, hanging their heads and leaving one after another. Dake looked at the upper grade students' reactions and couldn't help but cross his fingers and estimate. Looks like we have to be mentally prepared that we won't be able to win the Holy Grail this year. It wasn't that easy to obtain victory in the school championship competition, especially when the fourth year of the magic school had the Silver Dragon Lady. Last year's duel was the same. Not only did the Silver Dragon Girl obtain a victory in a duel between her peers, but she also obtained a second victory in a duel between those of a higher grade, helping the School of Magic win the duel. If the Aristocrat House didn't have such a huge advantage in the dungeon tournament, they wouldn't have been able to win the school championship tournament last year. Well, I have to rely on myself for everything. Dake took a deep breath and stood up from his seat. Fortunately, his current need for the Holy Grail wasn't that high. Soul Loss Curse had been upgraded to the elementary level with Professor Harvey's help. Underworld Spirit Spell had also reached the threshold of a breakthrough with Perseverance. Dake patted Doran's shoulder and said, "Don't be discouraged. Even if you lose this year, there's still next year." Chapter 442. A moment of success or failure may cause one to have a sleepless night, but when one woke up, one would have to face a much brighter tomorrow. In the blink of an eye, more than 20 days had passed in May. The Malian Academy's first-year students had finally ushered in their first exam week. After the final revision from Monday to Wednesday, from Thursday to Friday, there would be a practical exam every morning or afternoon. There were a total of 4 exams. For the first-year students, this was the final conclusion of a year of hard work. It was also the key to whether or not they could have a good long holiday. Some were eager to get into action, some were cramming at the last minute, some were simply trying to pass, and some were aiming for full marks. With careful observation, it was possible to read everyone's personality. When Dake came out of the library, it was already 10 at night. There were only a few people left in the reading room. He hugged his books and walked down the quiet corridor. In his heart, he was looking forward to tomorrow's practical exam. This was a mentality that he had never had in his previous life. He never thought that one day he would like to study and look forward to exams. Maybe it was because he really needed an exam to make a formal conclusion to his hard work this year. In short, the goal is to get first place in the grade. Remember the website, MVIP, can't you? 6. There were many talented first-year students this year. It was not easy to be first in the written exam. Whether it was Saraswati or AI Mametis, they were all very strong opponents. But Dake's advantage was in practice. The 4 practical exams were the key to him getting high marks. After returning to the dormitory, he spread out the exam schedule on the table and smiled confidently. Starting from 8 tomorrow morning, it will be the practical exam for the first summoning class. The practical exam for the summoning class is very simple. It is only a test of 2 summoning techniques. One is the normal summoning technique, and the other is the sacrificial summoning technique. The requirement for the normal summoning technique is to use the normal summoning technique to summon 3 magic cards in a row within a minute. In other words, the normal summoning technique's summoning time has been reduced to 12 seconds. The sacrificial summoning technique's requirement is even simpler. You only need to use the sacrificial summoning technique once to pass. There shouldn't be anyone who can't pass, right? After sticking close to the magic elves for a while, Dake washed up and went to sleep. Thursday, May 24th. It was drizzling, and the air was damp. Dake didn't leave the dormitory until 7 o'clock in the morning. He was neatly dressed in his school uniform, his hair was neatly combed, and there wasn't a single scratch on his fair face. He was so perfect that he looked like someone who had walked out of a painting. Most of the first-year students went out at this time. Not long after he walked out of the door, he met Deanna and Luosi, and then walked to a place. Deanna was as carefree as ever. She was not nervous about the exam at all. Of course, there was no need for her to be nervous. The practical test for the summoning class wasn't too difficult for her. However, Luosi was clearly nervous. Her magical talent was considered to be top-notch, but she didn't have much practical experience. Usually, the summoning test was actually quite difficult for her. Moreover, using 3 normal summoning spells within 12 seconds in a row, and compressing 1 normal summoning spell within 12 seconds were 2 completely different concepts. In order to pass the test, she had specially done intensive training this month, but she was still not confident. After all, there were many examples of mistakes made on the spot. Since Luosi was like this, the other students naturally wouldn't have it easy either. When the 3 of them arrived at the classroom, they found that the atmosphere in the classroom was unexpectedly dull. After Dake sat down at his usual spot, he turned his head slightly and looked around. He found that many of the students' lips were twitching, obviously cramming at the last minute. He couldn't help but be silent. Even though the exam time was after 8 o'clock, the classroom was already full of people at 7:30 in the morning. Professor Shi-Erfu, who was in charge of the summoning test, also entered the classroom not long after that. She greeted the students and wrote down today's test on the blackboard. Then, she turned to face the audience and gestured for everyone to be quiet. Only a few seconds later, the classroom was completely silent. Professor Shi-Erfu nodded with satisfaction and said, "There are still 15 minutes until the summoning test. The test itself isn't difficult. As long as you don't get nervous during the test, you should be able to pass. Of course, passing the standard line is just passing. If you want to get a higher score, you need to show more skills and proficiency. I will grade you on the spot based on your performance. Grading on the spot. The students who weren't good at summoning suddenly turned pale. Grading in front of so many students, if they failed, they would undoubtedly be publicly punished. Professor Shirfu's words not only didn't have the effect of comforting them, but also made them more nervous. Even those who were confident in passing the test couldn't help but be more concerned. However, there were also people who were excited because of this. For example, White Gouda was quite confident in his summoning skills. It was a sharp contrast to Luo Boat Broheim, who was next to him. Ring ring ring. At 8 o'clock sharp, as the bell rang, Professor Shirfu stood up and said, "The test will now begin. Those whose names are called, please come to the podium to receive your summoning card. Everyone will have 5 minutes to perform. First, Teddy Dolan from the Aristocratic Institute, Susan Bild from the Knight Institute, Magic Institute." Am I the first? When Dolan heard his name, he stood up abruptly, full of confidence. However, Susan, who was sitting at the table next to AI Ma, couldn't help but panic. For students from 4 institutes went on stage first. Then Professor Shirfu called out 4 more names and asked them to get ready. The 4 people who went to the podium received their summoning cards, one by one, and began to perform their summoning skills under the supervision of Professor Shirfu. Dolan glanced at the 3 people who went on stage at the same time and smiled. He picked out 3 one-star summoning cards and summoned them on the spot. He was very familiar with his usual summoning skills and had experienced many duels, so there was no need for him to be nervous in this kind of situation. This time he also smoothly summoned 3 large light balls in a row. Then, without stopping, he picked out 2 two-star summoning cards from the remaining summoning cards. He first used the usual summoning skill, then used the sacrificial summoning skill to summon the 4-star summoning card. As a huge 4-star light ball was summoned, he completed all the tests in only 2 minutes. When the last summoning was over, Dolan immediately turned his head to look at Professor Shirfu expectantly. Professor Shirfu nodded in satisfaction and said on the spot, "Very good. Although you're a little rusty with the sacrificial summoning skill, you're very familiar with the usual summoning skill. You can maintain a steady output of magic power even after continuous summoning. You're already considered excellent among the first-year students." "Then, Professor, how many points did I get?" Dolan immediately asked. Professor Shirfu said, "The usual summoning skill is 42 points, and the sacrificial summoning skill is 38 points. The total score is 80 points. Dolan, Dolan, who thought that he had at least 90 points, subconsciously opened his mouth to the size of an egg. Professor Shirfu, however, no longer looked at him. Susan Bild, the usual summoning skill needs to be improved, 32 points. The sacrificial summoning skill is barely passable, 30 points. The total score is 62 points. Susan put her hand on her chest and suddenly breathed a sigh of relief. Then she immediately turned her head and looked gratefully at AI Ma below the stage. AI Ma subconsciously shook her head, then suddenly reacted and reluctantly smiled at her. In order to help her 2 friends strengthen their summoning skills, she had worked hard for a long time. She didn't expect that Susan would still perform poorly because of nervousness when summoning on the stage. Otherwise, she would at least get 70 points, right? Thinking of this, she couldn't help but look at another friend beside her, Lucy. This glance made Lucy, who was already feeling nervous, suddenly feel a lot of pressure. She couldn't help but look away. The summoning skill assessment was carried out at a speed of 4 or 5 minutes per group. About half an hour later, Saraswati from the Magic Academy walked onto the podium confidently and got the first score of more than 90 points so far. Not long after, AI Ma Métis walked onto the podium under the gaze of all the students and got the second score of more than 90 points. Professor Shirfu's grading standards were not lax. Even Sarah and AI Ma didn't get 95 points. They were probably the only ones with stronger summoning skills than the 2 of them. The first-year students couldn't help but look back at Dake Dimming and White Gouda sitting in the last row. With Dake's summoning speed in the duel, not to mention 95 points, even full marks wouldn't be an exaggeration. They couldn't imagine, if Dake couldn't get full marks, who else in the first year could get full marks? As for White, White's summoning speed was only comparable to AI Ma and Sarah in the previous duel, so it was possible for her to get 95 points. Noble Academy Luo Si Flati Knight Academy. Prepare in advance. Professor Shi Erfa's voice interrupted the students' thoughts. Under Deanna's encouragement, Luo Si walked onto the podium with a nervous expression. After a few minutes, the nervousness on her face disappeared, and she walked off the podium happily. Just now, Professor Shi Erfa gave her 72 points. Watching her walk off the podium, Dick supported his chin with his hand. He was originally a little worried, but Luo Si exposed her strength as soon as she opened her mouth. 72 points, and she didn't perform well. He was really worried. Not long after, Deanna confidently walked onto the podium and performed. In the end, she got a high score of 93 points, attracting the attention of the whole audience. At almost 10 o'clock, Dake finally heard his name. Noble Academy Dake Dimung Knight Academy Luo Boat Broheim, Sorcerer Academy. When Dake stood up, he smiled at Luo Boat, who was looking at him from the other side, and walked to the podium. After waiting for a round, he took a set of summoning cards from the box next to Professor Shi Erfu and walked to the center of the podium. When all 4 students were in position, Professor Shi Erfu gave the order, and the 4 students began to summon at the same time. 3 seconds later, Dake summoned the first 1-star light ball. 9 seconds later, the second 1-star light ball was summoned. 15 seconds later, the third 1-star light ball was summoned. 21 seconds later, the first 2-star light ball was summoned. 27 seconds later, the second 2-star light ball was summoned. 36 seconds later, the last 4-star light ball was summoned. When the gigantic 4-star light balls emerged from the sacrificial summoning circle, the 3 students next to him were still trying to summon one. Splat! Luo Boat was shocked by the sudden appearance of the gigantic light ball, and he accidentally bit his tongue. The normal summoning technique that was difficult to even reach the threshold of passing suddenly became even more difficult. There's nothing to say. Dake Dimming full marks. Professor Shi Erfa's voice was very calm. The students in the classroom weren't too surprised either. It was as if everything was expected. If it wasn't full marks, it would be strange. After Dake returned the set of summoning cards to Professor Shi Erfu, he leisurely returned to his seat. Not long after he sat down, the 3 students who took the exam with him also left the stage. Luo Boat, who was the last to leave the stage, had a pale face. White couldn't help but comfort him. It's okay, Luo Boat. Didn't a lot of people fail as well? The more the merrier. Luo Boat. White went up next, but only got 92 points. The practical exam for the summoning class ended before 11 o'clock. Regardless of whether they passed or not, they all went straight to the cafeteria. After eating, they quickly returned to their dorms to prepare for the potionology practical exam. Compared to the summoning class, which had a fixed goal, the potionology practical exam was obviously more difficult. Professor Thompson, who was in charge of potionology, didn't even reveal what the exam was about. This made the students who weren't good at potionology nervous. For example, Deanna, who was full of confidence in the morning, was like a frosted eggplant in the afternoon. Don't be nervous. The most important thing in potionology is to have a steady hand and a steady heart. You have both, there's no way you can't do it. In order to ease Deanna's nerves, Dake went against his will. Then Deanna, who had regained her vitality, suffered a painful defeat in the potionology practical exam in the afternoon. Looking at the black foam crazily coming out of the crucible, Deanna couldn't help but purse her lips. But there were many people who suffered the same fate as her. Because of this, the entire laboratory was filled with a rotten stench. Professor Thompson crossed his arms in front of his chest and sneered at the panicked students. He had always believed that a little mistake in class is a tear in the exam. This time, he had specially chosen a more difficult potion experiment to give the students a good lesson. Of course, it wasn't as if there weren't any students in this laboratory that he was satisfied with. Not to mention the few top students, there were also a few girls from the School of Magic who were quite talented in potionology. The potionology practical exam started at 2 in the afternoon and ended at 4 in the afternoon. It was a total of 2 hours. When Professor Thompson announced that the exam time was up, at least half of the students in the classroom were still struggling with the potions in the crucibles. Even if the students managed to successfully make the potions, the quality of the potions they made wasn't high. Professor Thompson only picked out 5 potions that were relatively perfect, and gave the owners of these potions more than 90 points. Of course, he didn't give the potions on the spot. Instead, he ordered the students to tidy up the leftovers of the experiment, and strode out of the classroom. Dake, who had successfully completed the experiment an hour ago, looked at the black water in White and Luo Boat's crucibles, and couldn't help but show a trace of pity. Deanna at least made a half-finished product on her 3rd attempt. These two were the ones who were really miserable. I really didn't think that so many people would fail in the 2 exams today. Dake shook his head, and left the classroom after helping Deanna and Luo C tidy up the lab tables. He really couldn't imagine how so many people could fail in the 2 classes. But reality always made people helpless. Just like the Introduction to Magic practical exam the next day on Friday morning, there were also many people who couldn't make a complete magic card according to the requirements. The difficulty of making the magic card that Professor Kazair chose could only be described as average. But it seemed that some of the students' standards were worse than he expected. Or maybe it was because he was used to Dake's standards that there was a slight deviation in his understanding of the first-year student standards. In the midst of the wailing of almost half of the students, the practical exam of the dual class finally began. The students had to pull themselves together to prepare for the dual exam. Chapter 443. The dual assessment was held in Battle Hall 1. Professor Pawa Cheongsi was still dressed in a fresh outfit. She had already arrived at Battle Hall 1 before 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Along with her were first-year Professor Kazair, Professor Shi Erfu, and Professor Li Li. Professor Kazair observed the facilities of the Battle Hall with great interest. He asked casually, "Professor Cheongsi, what's the competition system for this assessment?" Professor Cheongsi crossed his arms and said, "Of course it's the rookie competition system. Not everyone in the first year is Dake Dimeng. It's already very difficult to gather 20 useful magic cards at the end of the semester." Professor Li Li immediately raised his head and said, "Of course." Professor Shi Erfu asked in a serious tone, "Pawa, since you asked us to grade, you should have a detailed grading system, right?" Professor Cheongsi smiled and nodded, "Of course." However, when Professor Shi Erfu's expression softened, Professor Cheongsi quickly said, "Your grading system is the best standard." Professor Shi Erfu's face instantly darkened. Even Professor Kazair was stunned. Only Professor Li Li seemed to be very happy. Professor Shi Erfu said helplessly, "Forget it. Since there's still time, let's discuss the grading system together." Professor Kazair looked up at Cheongsi and asked suspiciously, "Professor Cheongsi, is this the effect you want?" Professor Cheongsi quickly waved his hand and said, "How is that possible? I really believe in you guys." While the 4 professors were urgently setting the rules, the first-year students were also forcing themselves to rush to Battle Hall 1. The failure of the 3 assessments in a row caused some of the students to fall into an unprecedented low. The dual assessment, which had attracted a lot of attention, seemed to have lost its appeal. Perhaps before this, no one would have thought that the practical assessment would be more difficult than the previous one. Some students even predicted that they would fail all 3 assessments, and walked with a swaying gait. Only some of the top students with good grades were still looking forward to this dual assessment, wanting to prove themselves in the dual assessment. As more and more people entered number 1 Battle Hall, the atmosphere in the Battle Hall became oppressive. I have that feeling. Dake Dimeng, on the other hand, was quite familiar with the oppressive atmosphere before the exam. A trace of nostalgia appeared on his face as he strode into Battle Hall 1. The rules of the dual assessment had been set long ago. The assessment was based on the rules of the newcomer competition. The number of magic cards in the participating card deck had to be within the range of 20 to 40 cards. As for the magic conducting orb, the life enchantment was at level 2, which was 2,000 points. 1. The arena was 30 by 20, which was slightly larger than a basketball court. After getting used to the 120 by 80 arena, one would feel that it was too small and difficult to use. And the life enchantment at 2,000 points was too weak. It felt like it could be shattered with a snap of the finger. Dake shook his head and stopped thinking about it. He wasn't too interested in the duel assessment itself, but the small goal of getting first place in the grade was enough to turn him into a duel machine. The duel assessment this time was purely random. Every student had to go through 2 rounds of duels. The invigilating professors would grade the 2 rounds of duels separately, and the final score would be the final score of the duel assessment. Professor Cheong-si said on the surface that he didn't care about the outcome, only the process. But in reality, everyone knew that winning a duel would definitely give you more points. I wonder who my opponent will be. Dake couldn't help but sweep his gaze around the arena, and then quickly looked away. 10 minutes later, the 4 professors, who had urgently set the grading criteria, stepped onto the stage, attracting the attention of all the students. The students subconsciously gathered below the stage, and everyone looked up at the professors, waiting for the assessment to begin. As the professor of the duel class, Pawa Jones took the center position and said loudly, "Today's duel assessment will be jointly supervised by me and your professors of summoning arts, introduction to magic, and arithmetic. The rules of the assessment have been repeatedly mentioned in the previous classes. If you still don't understand, then continue to not understand. Now come on stage to receive your number plates." It was still the same red and blue number plates. They only needed to be injected with magic to split them into red and blue halves. The students stepped onto the stage one by one, and after receiving their number plates, they split them and returned the blue halves. They only kept the red ones. After everyone had received their number plates, Professor Cheong-si took out 4 pairs of blue number plates from the jar, and then announced the 4 pairs of numbers on the spot. The students who had been selected took their number plates to Arena 1 to Arena 4, and stepped onto the stage to prepare for the duel. The 4 professors went to the judges' seats in the 4 arenas, acting as referees and raters. Without any superfluous events, the 1st to 4th duels of the first round began with a uniform whistle. As the countdown to the round appeared in the projection, the first-year students were inexplicably energized and recovered from their dispirited state of mind. The natural attraction of the duel made the students subconsciously put other things to the back of their minds, and gradually focused on the duel. The 8 dueling contestants stood on the stage and looked down, their expressions suddenly serious. In the blink of an eye, half an hour had passed, and the duel assessment was in full swing. Since the duel class hadn't had a duel for a very long time, most of the first-year students were very unfamiliar with the duel. But as time passed, they obviously became more familiar with the duel, and the duel also looked like it. The 4 professors graded the students according to their performance in the duel, but they didn't report the scores. This made some of the students uneasy, especially those who lost in the duel. Outside of Arena 1, Dake stood there and watched the duel. He gradually understood the average level of the first-year students. Deanna next to him also went from being eager at the beginning to being bored to death. On the other side, Luo-si gradually became less nervous. When another duel ended, Professor Cheong-si pulled out a set of number plates, and then immediately said in a clear voice, "Next group, number 66, number 29. It's my turn." Dake's heart skipped a beat. He picked up the number plate in his hand and glanced at it. Then he turned his head slightly and noticed that number 29, Justin Wayne, also turned his head and looked around. So the 2 people's eyes met for a moment, and they suddenly understood that this was their opponent in the first round of the duel. Is it him? Dake's interest was slightly piqued. Compared to the other students who hadn't even participated in the newcomers' competition, Justin Wayne, one of the 7 first-year duelists, was considered an opponent that he looked forward to. He nodded slightly at Justin Wayne, then turned around and said to the 2 people next to him, "I'll go up first." "Good luck." Deanna waved her small fist. Luo-si also said shyly, "Good luck." So Dake walked to the red side's platform. When Justin Wayne confirmed that his opponent was Dake Dimeng, his face couldn't help but flash with a bitter expression. His friends next to him also patted him on the shoulder, and there was a moment of silence. "Don't be afraid, Justin. Professor Cheong-si said that he won't judge based on the outcome. Do you believe that? But we can only believe it, right? In short, good luck. Do your best. If you can last one round, you win. That's too exaggerated. Even if it's Dake, I'm not completely powerless. I can last 2 or 3 rounds. Forget it, I'll go up first. Justin Wayne shook his head and walked to the Blue Side's platform. As the two people walked out, the spectating students immediately began to discuss. Dake Dimming aside, Justin Wayne was also a popular figure in the first year of the Night Academy. His upright character and sunny and healthy appearance made it easy for people to have a good impression of him. He was different from the more reclusive Ai Ma and White of the Night Academy. He had gathered a lot of supporters. Due to the unchanging bad relationship between the Night Academy and the Noble Academy, there were many students who hoped that Justin Wayne could reverse the situation and win. Of course, the Noble Academy students were disdainful and sneered. They didn't think that Justin Wayne had any chance of winning. It's been almost 2 months since Easter, right? Justin Wayne must be progressing at lightning speed. Dolong and Pitten muttered. But in the blink of an eye, they said, of course Dake's progress is faster. The most despairing thing about Dake Dimming was that he was stronger and more hardworking than you. The gap between the two would only widen with the passage of time. Unless Dake Dimming reached a bottleneck, and occasionally looked back at the scenery. The spectators still had the energy to mutter, but when Justin Wayne stepped onto the platform, the pressure was already at its peak. His forehead was slightly sweaty because of the sudden warm weather. His right hand unconsciously clenched into a fist, and he was rarely nervous. As a person with a typical knight's personality, he was usually brave and gentle, confident and not flamboyant. Even in the previous rookie competition, he had performed brilliantly. Later, when Dake no longer paid attention to the duels because he had enough credits, he would occasionally go on stage. He had accumulated a lot of experience and credits, allowing him to constantly improve. When facing the duelists of the second years, his chances of winning were gradually increasing. But the more it was like this, the more he understood how terrifying Dake's ability to obtain the final victory of the first to third years at the Easter Duel Festival was. Thus, the pressure he was under right now was unimaginable to outsiders. Even so, the platform was only so long, and he had to finish walking. When he stepped onto the blue platform, Dake was already waiting on the red platform. The two contestants did not have much interaction in the academy. After stepping onto the platform, they merely greeted each other, then took out their respective card decks, and placed them in the card slots of the card table. As the card table was reactivated, a projection appeared in front of the platform. Dake touched the card table again after 2 months, but he still did not look the least bit rusty. When he was ready, he raised his hand and quietly waited for the whistle to sound. Beep! Professor Cheong-si suddenly blew the whistle, and the atmosphere on the field instantly became tense. Preparation stage. 30s. When the projection of the 30-second countdown appeared, both contestants drew their cards at the same time. Whether it was contempt or fear, from the moment the duel began, it became insignificant outside factors. A true duelist only had eyes for each other. The duel begins. Dake instantly drew his cards. 5 magic cards were in his hand. Then he turned the cards in his hand and unfolded them like a folding fan. The 5 magic cards reflected in his eyes, and his brain's thoughts were synchronized, quickly thinking about the tactics and strategies that could be used. Then a smile appeared. Bliss 3 Moon, Fantasy Beast, Ibu Dream Demon, Vampire's Daughter. 2 Bliss 3 Moon cards were in his hand at the same time, making everything particularly simple. In the newcomers competition where the number of cards could be freely adjusted between 20 to 40 cards, Dake did not have any useless cards in his hand, and no matter how he started, he would not be bad. In particular, the addition of Vampire's Daughter, Moon God Soul Eye, and Primordial Dragon Egg made it easier to activate his card deck. This time, with 5 cards in his hand if he wanted, he could start with Dream Demon, and then trigger Vampire's Secret Instrument to directly summon Vampire's Daughter, using the strength of the 7-star magic card to make his opponent feel despair. But he did not intend to do that. Tick, As the 30-second countdown ended, the turn changed. Battle stage, 30s. When Dake raised his hand to summon, he could clearly see Justin Wayne's expression slightly relaxed. But that didn't affect him at all. It's decided to be you, Dream Demon. Due to the difference in summoning speed between the two sides, Dake had already completed his summoning when Justin Wayne's normal summoning was only halfway through. The Dream Demon quickly drilled out from the card surface and flew towards the blue side without any delay. When Justin Wayne's normal summoning was finally completed, Dake had already begun his second normal summoning. But Justin Wayne's 3-star magic fairy finally blocked the Dream Demon in front of the blue side's summoning area. It was a bald knight wearing armor with a heart-shaped opening on its chest, riding on a pink giant boar. Heart Knight. Although its appearance was slightly flawed, the Heart Knight was very powerful. In terms of its 3 attributes, it was one of the best among the 3-star magic fairies, and its ultimate skill, Heart Rescue, was a divine healing skill that had a special effect on its mount. But the difference in class was difficult to overcome. When the Heart Knight raised his long spear under Justin Wayne's command and released another ultimate skill, Love Ray, at the Dream Demon, an even stronger pink light shone on the Dream Demon's body. The Dream Demon, who was making a funny face, instantly evolved under the effect of Bliss 3, Moon. The Dream Demon, who looked like a witch, quickly took shape under the light of evolution. Then, it mercilessly shattered the heart-shaped ray and pounced on the Heart Knight. Fear descended. It shouldn't be a problem to update 8,000 times today. Chapter 444. Even though the Heart Knight's magic attack and defense were top-notch. However, a numerical value that had yet to break through the 3-star limit was still like a child in front of a 5-star Dream Demon. The Love Ray's charm effect could make people's hearts weak, but it had no effect on the Dream Demon, transformed from Bliss. When Justin Wayne was still anxiously waiting for the cooldown of the first summon to end, the Heart Knight, that he was proud of, had been torn apart by the Dream Demon. And the magic conducting ball with only 2,000 HP was completely exposed in front of the Dream Demon, with 2,500 attack power. Only a Kacha sound was heard. Even though Justin Wayne had already used all his strength to release magic to make the magic conducting ball fly into the sky, the Dream Demon was still chasing after him. Its claws easily pierced through the magic conducting ball's life enchantment. Magic conducting ball, Blue 2000. Beep. Professor Cheongsi immediately blew the whistle. The tip of the whistle still had the heat from before. In less than 1 round. No, less than half a round. Website. https://m. Vipcanchu. VIP. The first-year Knight Academy's most influential figure, Justin Wayne, was defeated without any warning. At that moment, Justin Wayne's heart fell to the bottom. He originally thought that with the strength of the Heart Knight, it would be enough to withstand Dake's initial burst. Then his second Heart Knight would be able to form a Knight bond with the Heart Knight, allowing the 2 top-notch 3-star Knights to obtain an overall upgrade. Then they would be able to fight against Dake's usual 4-star magic conducting fairies. But this time, the magic conducting fairy that Dake summoned and evolved was a 5-star Dream Demon. This made him unable to fight back. He could only stretch his neck and wait for the slaughter. I actually didn't even last 1 round. Justin Wayne subconsciously bit his lips, and the veins on the back of his hand that was holding the magic conducting card popped out. This painful result almost made him deny all the hard work he had put in all this time. Why did I work so hard? Justin Wayne, who got off the stage, was in a trance. His friends could only comfort him by saying things like, "It's nothing, it's Dake after all, and come again next time." On the other side of the contestant stage, Dake's face clearly showed that he hadn't had enough. He turned around and walked off the stage. He had thought that Justin Wayne would be able to pique his interest, but it turned out that this was not the case. There's still 1 more round. I hope the next opponent will give me a pleasant surprise. He shook his head and returned to his original spot under the gazes of the students from the aristocratic academy. The duel assessment didn't stop because of his outstanding performance. One group of contestants after another were called out. Dake focused on his observations and realized that the first-year students had indeed improved a lot. Especially the batch of students who had defeated the dungeon boss with him. They all had different cards in their hands, and their performance in this duel was outstanding. Number 3, number 28. My turn. Deanna felt refreshed and stepped forward. Then she won without any suspense. Among the first-year students, she had clearly stood out. Together with AI Ma and Sarah, they were called the three hegemons of the first-year students. They represented the Aristocratic Academy, the Knight Academy, and the Magic Academy respectively. Not long after she returned, it was finally Luoxi's turn to go on stage. Your turn. Deanna grabbed Luoxi's arm and shook it. Luoxi nervously took out her number and said, I know. Deanna leaned over and whispered in her ear, Don't be nervous, they're very weak. Luoxi. But, Deanna emphasized, Really, you'll know when you go up and try. They're super weak. No, forget it. Luoxi helplessly walked to the second arena. She naturally thought that Deanna was cheering her on, but she didn't know that Deanna was actually telling the truth. Dake, who had been eavesdropping, blinked and followed Deanna to the edge of the second arena. At this time, another contestant just happened to go on stage. Dake looked carefully and found that he couldn't remember the other person's name. He asked, Deanna, who's that over there? Deanna tilted her head and thought for a while, then said, I think he's from the House of Fools. I don't really remember. It seemed that the other person's presence was really weak. The House of Aristocrats and the House of Fools didn't have much contact, so neither of them could say the other person's name. However, that person had brown hair and brown eyes. He had delicate features, but there were a few freckles on his face, which made him look mediocre. After he and Luoxi went on stage, both of them looked timid. It was obvious that they weren't good at duels. However, as soon as the match started, the difference in strength between the two of them immediately became apparent. Luoxi summoned the Mobius worm, which was like an impenetrable steel fortress in front of her. When the Mobius worm's energy level changed from 1 to 7, it suddenly released a supersonic wave that instantly killed the opponent's strongest trump card. Then she actually used the 3-star Mobius worm and the 1-star magical fantasy beast Snow Rabbit as sacrifices to summon a second-tier 4-star magical guide sprite, Rainbow-horned rabbit. The rabbit was as strong as a calf, and the horn on its head was half a meter long. It was as smooth as jade and emitted a rainbow-colored light. It completely overturned the common impression that humans had of rabbits. Dake recognized at a glance that it should have been refined using the horn obtained from killing the two-headed demon boss as the core. In Luoxi's deck, this rainbow-horned rabbit was obviously the most aggressive. With its rainbow-colored horn, it charged forward and smashed through all the defenses of the student from the House of Fools in the blink of an eye. Then, it pierced through the life barrier, which only had 2,000 HP. The difference in strength between the two sides was especially obvious at that moment. The student from the House of Fools, who originally thought that he had drawn a good lot, suddenly turned pale and lost miserably. Even so, this duel did bring a smile for Luoxi. Luoxi, who came down from the stage, was obviously in high spirits. Her fair face was flushed, and there was still a lingering excitement from her crushing victory. Well done. Dake raised his hand and gave her a high five. Then Luoxi and Deanna gathered together and shared their joy. Not long after Luoxi's duel ended, the first round of the duel assessment was finally completed. In the first round of the duel, most of the students had performed well. Among them, there were expected crushing victories like Dake's, unexpected defeats like Justin's, and of course, unexpected victories like Luoxi's. AI Ma, Sarah, White, and the others, who had received a lot of attention, also showed strength that surpassed the level of the first years. AI Ma successfully refined the magic crystal coins obtained from killing the Tier 1 boss, the two-headed demon, into a powerful magic fairy, making up for her lack of a second-tier magic fairy. The same was true for Sarah. Her deck had always been more unpredictable and weaker in frontal attacks. Now, she had made up for her shortcomings very well. As for White, she was already able to use the Holy Sword freely, and she also had a magic fairy. In short, The 7 first-year duelists who joined the duel club early all performed well, except for the unlucky Justin Wayne. After the first round of the duel assessment ended, the 4 professors gathered together to exchange their opinions. Then, they rested for 15 minutes, and then the second round of the duel assessment began. As soon as the second round of the duel assessment began, there was a highlight that didn't appear in the first round. It couldn't help but make people wonder if the professors were secretly manipulating things. Venue 3. Sorcerer School Saraswati vs. Aristocratic School Deanna Greatbear. With some of the boys taking the lead, the competition between the girls was especially obvious. Sarah, AI Ma, and Deanna were undoubtedly the most dazzling girls in the first year. However, the 3 of them gave off very different impressions. Sarah was knowledgeable and extroverted. She was like a queen in the first year of the sorcerer school. AI Ma was diligent, intelligent, and determined, but she didn't get along well with others. She was like a scholar who focused on learning. On the other hand, Deanna was lively and cute. She was pure and straightforward, but she gave people the impression that she was a little stupid. She couldn't have achieved what she had today without Dake's help and supervision. Comparing the 2 of them, it was natural for people to feel that Diana was the weaker one among the 3. This time, Sarah's duel with Deanna was especially eye-catching. Oh. Deanna looked at Sarah opposite her, and couldn't help but want to cover her head. Sarah happened to be the type that she was the worst at dealing with. If it was the previous Sarah who didn't have the ability to face the sorcerer elf head-on, she would have some chance of winning. However, the current Sarah had completely made up for her shortcomings, and she was even stronger in terms of slyness. She really didn't want to be Sarah's opponent now. However, since she was already matched, she could only bite the bullet and go up. Luosi, wait for me to come back. Deanna walked towards the contestants' platform in Venue 3. Her back was lonely, and her attitude was determined. She was like an old general who was about to go to war. For some reason, Dake couldn't help but want to laugh, but he held it in. Dake, who do you think will win, Deanna or Sarah? Luosi couldn't help but ask. Dake shook his head slightly. First, it depends on luck, and second, it depends on quick-wittedness. Sarah might be defeated by Deanna's brute force, or Deanna might step into a trap and be unable to turn the situation around. Luosi couldn't help but ask. So, do Deanna have a high chance of winning? Dake then said, not really. Luosi, Dake couldn't help but smile. Don't worry. Even if she loses, Deanna won't be defeated so easily. Also, losing isn't all bad. Let her lose once before the holidays, so that she won't be too relaxed when she goes back. If you don't improve in your studies, you will fall behind. The 3-month-long holiday is actually a very challenging time. If you just play like crazy during these 3 months, you will fall behind when you come back. A long holiday. Luosi opened her mouth, but she thought of something else. Her mood was obviously down. Dake noticed this and asked softly, what's wrong? Don't you want to go home? Luosi couldn't help but lower her head and answer, yes. Dake raised his eyebrows and said, you're staying at your uncle's house, right? Luosi, yes. Dake, actually, you don't have to worry too much. Maybe when you go back, you will find that your family isn't so bad. Beep. Professor Lily whistled fiercely, and the game began. Deanna, who was in the preparation stage, immediately entered battle mode. The previous worry and depression seemed to have become an illusion, and she suddenly turned into a roaring bear. Opposite her, Saraswati smiled sweetly, like a gorgeous poisonous snake. The cards and tactics of the 2 were like a bear and a snake. One was fierce and domineering, while the other was enchanting and vicious. An extremely fierce collision occurred. The final result was just as Dake said. Although Deanna was fierce and unparalleled, she was still no match for Sarah's craftiness. In the end, she was nibbled away by the poisonous snake and fell down. Although both sides performed very well in this duel, the winner was the king, and the loser was the bandit. Sarah immediately received a round of applause, while Deanna couldn't help but purse her lips because of the defeat. Of course, she wouldn't cry, but her small fists were clenched very tightly. Deanna, Sarah suddenly said. Deanna slightly raised her head and looked at her. Sarah blinked and said, "Next semester, I will wait for you to take revenge." Deanna's eyes instantly flashed with sparks. Duels were like this. Winning or losing once didn't mean winning or losing forever. Only by constantly moving forward could one break through one's limits again and again. When Deanna came down from the stage, her expression had already returned to normal. This duel with Sarah had obviously taught her a lesson, and she had indeed regained her desire to fight. Not long after, Luosi came on stage again. Her luck was not bad. Her opponent this time was still an unremarkable student. Although the student from the Night Academy already knew the characteristics of the Mobius worm, he still didn't know where to start and was defeated in the end. Luosi suddenly breathed a sigh of relief and came down from the stage. These two duels had consumed a lot of her energy, but fortunately, she won them both. In fact, she didn't have much desire to win, and she didn't have any requirements for her results, as long as she didn't fail. After Luosi's duel test was successfully completed, only Dake was left in the group of 3. He quietly waited for his turn, and then slowly watched the anticipated opponents come on stage one by one. In the end, even Aima came on stage. He couldn't help but be speechless. It wasn't easy to come across a duel test, and of course he wanted to have a little fun, but it seemed that the heavens didn't give him what he wanted. He shook his head and sighed. Number 66. When Professor Cheongsi finally called his number, he was a little more spirited. "Dake, it's your turn." Deanna elbowed his waist. He quickly said, "I heard you." Then Professor Cheongsi called the next number. Number 104, Venue 1. Number 104. Dake thought for a while and quickly reacted. "Is it White?" He looked around and saw that White Gouda was also looking over with a number plate. Dake looked back. Of course, he also paid attention to White's duel in the last round, but because White's opponent wasn't too strong, he didn't show too much strength. He didn't know how he had changed in the past 2 months. In theory, the return of Scarlet Blood Concubine would help White's growth. However, Scarlet Blood Concubine wasn't a professor, so she didn't have the right to give out credits and couldn't provide material support. At most, she could only assist in education. Although what Werther lacked was education, whether or not the two of them would be able to work together was another matter altogether. Scarlet Blood Concubine was actually in a state of house arrest. She wasn't allowed to walk around the school freely, and she couldn't have too much contact with White. However, in the past 2 months, Dake occasionally saw White and Tom Nixon walking together. Tom Nixon was a third-year student of the House of Fools. He was a mixed blood born in the slums and had competed with Dake in the finals of the Easter Duel Festival. He had also participated in Scarlet Blood Concubine's ceremony. He had some relationship with Scarlet Blood Concubine. Judging from the fact that Tom Nixon used the Bloodthirsty series of magic cards, their connection was quite strong. White, who had inherited Scarlet Blood Concubine's bloodline, should in theory have the aptitude for blood magic. Perhaps he could learn something from Tom Nixon. In short, when Dake knew that his opponent was White, he began to rack his brains to increase his settings, hoping that he would really become stronger. Otherwise, it would be too boring. On the other side, after learning that his opponent in the second round of the duel assessment was Dake, White couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. He was a little excited. Although he no longer had any hostility toward Dake, he still set him as a goal. He wanted to be as outstanding as Dake, or even surpass him. To be able to have a duel with Dake at the end of the first year was an ideal ending for him. If he could bite off some of Dake's scales in this duel, that would be even better. "Hey White, what's up with you?" Luo Boat suddenly asked. White quickly calmed down and said, "I'm burning up." Luo Boat quickly touched his forehead and then asked doubtfully, "It's not hot? Why don't I ask the professor to let you take a sick leave and leave early? Anyway, you have no chance of winning against Dake." White was speechless. After a while, White said, "Can we talk about something else?" "Okay then." Luo Boat shrugged and said, "Do your best. You win if you can last through 1 round." White said quietly, "Luo Boat, there's something I haven't told you." Luo Boat was puzzled. "What's wrong?" White said, "You're very annoying." Luo Boat slapped his shoulder hard. "Ha, you finally said it." "Ouch." White clenched his teeth in pain. Stop messing around. Luoboat slapped his butt and pushed him out. Hurry up and come back early. Don't waste everyone's time. White rubbed his shoulder and grimaced. But in the end, he still walked towards the player platform of Venue 1. Dake had already stepped onto the red player platform. He put his hand on the card table and looked past the transparent screen to see White going up the stage. His eyes were calm, but they seemed to have traveled through time. In the blink of an eye, 9 months had passed since the start of school. He still clearly remembered the shock he felt when he regained his memories of his previous life during the sorting ceremony. At the time, he was still looking for someone who might be the main character of the original game. He paid special attention to the main character of the original game, who was Harry Potter. But today, he suddenly realized that he hadn't interacted with White for 2 months. Unknowingly, the two of them had walked on 2 parallel lines that didn't intersect. He gradually became convinced that he would be able to analyze and even control the great sin in the future. There was no need for him to have anything to do with this future hero. Over the past year, he had indeed carried out the idea he had at the start of school. He just needed to keep doing this. As his mind became clearer, Dake's mind became calmer and calmer. He waited until White stepped onto the player platform before activating the card table. Then he put the card deck into the card slot on the table and injected magic power into it to automatically shuffle the cards. On the blue player platform, White hurriedly put the card deck into the card slot on the table and activated the shuffle. Dake. Yes. White's sudden voice made Dake raise his head slightly. White said, I haven't had a chance to formally thank you, but I'm really grateful. Dake raised his eyebrows and said, That's not necessary. If you're really sincere, please find a chance to formally thank me. White said again, I know that I'm no match for you even if I try my best, but I won't admit defeat. Dake nodded. It's okay, as long as you can smile. White, huh? Dake. I hope this duel can bring smiles to both of us. Beep. Preparation stage. 30s. The moment the exchange segment ended, it was like the 30-second countdown to the preparation stage. Dake didn't hesitate to reach for a card. White, on the other hand, was stunned for a while before he made his move. This was the first official duel between the two of them since school started. Even though it was just a rookie competition, it was very meaningful for White. Perhaps this would let him know how big the gap between him and his target was, and how hard he needed to work to catch up with his target. As for the significance of this duel to Dake, it was somewhat meaningful, but not much. After the 5 magic cards were in his hand, he immediately opened them. Even a lion would use all its strength to catch a rabbit. Primordial Dragon Egg, Single Scabbard Weapon Form. Greed 3. Pot Pot. Milken. The first card was Primordial Dragon Egg. With this 3-star Magic Elf card as the starting card, Dake could quickly hatch a 6-star Magic Elf. The premise was that his 1,500 points of defense wouldn't be broken in an instant. In fact, the possibility was very low. The second card, Single Scabbard Weapon Form, could be transformed to summon a 4-star Magic Elf at a faster speed. If he used Greed 3, he could also summon a 6-star Magic Elf. The only problem was that Double Scabbard's stats were inferior to Young Blue-Eyed Dragon, but its ultimate skill was stronger. Both sides have their own strengths and weaknesses. But the rookie has priority. It's decided then, Dragon Egg. Keep up the good work before 6. Chapter 445. In the name of Dake Dimming, I summon the first Dragon Egg. When Dake began to summon, even the professors in charge of the other 3 arenas subconsciously turned their gazes over. Of course, they only wanted to take a glance before turning back. But with this glance, they couldn't move anymore. A huge dragon egg appeared from the summoning light, quietly standing in front of the red magic ball. It didn't have any limbs and was obviously unable to move. It was a special type of magic fairy. Although this kind of egg-shaped magic fairy wasn't common, it wasn't rare. It was just that very few people used it. However, the dragon egg that Dake summoned emitted a faint primitive aura. It was a sense of time that ordinary people couldn't sense at all, causing the expressions of the three professors to turn serious. Unlike the professors who had sharp senses, White Gouda instinctively felt a sense of crisis when he saw Dake summon an egg. He tried his best to increase the summoning speed, compressing it to nearly 5 seconds. Among the first-year students, except for Dake, the best students could at most compress the casting time of a normal summoning spell to this extent. Remember the website, MVIP can't you? 6 But in reality, this was already the standard for the second-year final exam. It was a very good result. Therefore, before the dragon egg had successfully hatched, White's first magic fairy had already appeared in the blue summoning area. But it was also a brand new magic fairy that was unexpected. At this time, the spectating students suddenly realized that the two duelists had summoned magic fairies that had never been revealed before. This made them instinctively feel that both sides had taken out their respective trump cards. And White's side was indeed the same. The magic fairy he summoned was under the guidance of Tom Nixon. He collected his own blood and refined it as a special auxiliary material, then used another material as the core to refine it. The refining method was also mysterious. It was a special refining method that could only be used by magisters with special talents. He used this method to refine a total of 3 magic fairies, each of which was very powerful. For example, this magic guide elf was one of the best 3-star elves, and it had almost replaced Giant Monster in his heart. It was a terrifyingly huge worm as thick as a bucket. Card name, Giant Bloodworm. Type, Elf card. Level, *****. Race, Insect. Attribute, Worm. Magic power, 1450 attack, 1450 defense, 1450 ultimate skill, Bloodthirst, blood refining insect armor, blood source explosion. The 3 sure kill skills made the gigantic bloodworm have the qualifications of 3 orange cards. Although its attack was 50 points lower than Giant Monster, it was still a standard barrel-shaped waist. However, compared to the actual attack and defense of a 3-star magic guide fairy, 50 points of attack was nothing. Other than that, the giant bloodworm was stronger than the giant monster in every aspect. Especially the 3 sure kill skills, whether it was Bloodlust, which could guarantee the user's endurance, Blood Refining Bug Armor, which could increase the user's attack and defense, or Blood Source Explosion, which could self-destruct and turn into a corresponding number of blood bugs after the explosion, were all extremely useful. White Gouda had watched the duel between Dake and Justin Wayne. He knew that Dake could summon a 5-star magic guide fairy in just 9 seconds. Although his giant bloodworm was also unable to fight against a 5-star magic guide fairy, he could use its self-explosion to seriously injure it. Then he could use the bloodworms that were formed after the self-explosion as a sacrifice to summon a 5-star magic guide fairy, Blood Demon. The Blood Demon that could be summoned as long as there was a specific environment was White's strongest trump card. If even Blood Demon couldn't win that 1 point, then it was a loss. It could be considered a struggle. After all, White Gouda didn't think that he could win from the bottom of his heart. Just as Luoboat said, he would win if he could last a few more rounds. At least he was stronger than Justin Wayne. However, even if he couldn't back down from this bottom line, he still needed to have the strength to defend it. While he had taken a big step forward in 2 months, Dake's progress would only be greater. Even though the hatching took some time, when Victor's giant bloodworm wriggled its huge body over, the primordial dragon egg was already filled with cracks. Roar! Under everyone's gaze. Although it was still young, there was no doubt that an angry roar with the power of a dragon erupted from the eggshell. The silver-white baby dragon with green eyes suddenly broke the eggshell and hatched from within. At the same time, Dake, whose summoning skill was off cooldown, started to summon Kettle's summoning light descended. It was when the cyanide baby dragon flew into the sky. That dragon whelp, which was nearly 3 meters tall, carried with it an immature dragon's aura as it pounced toward the blue side like the wind. The space that was too narrow for a dragon was crossed in the blink of an eye. The giant bloodworm suddenly straightened its upper body. Its blood-red wrinkles rolled and emitted a bright red light. Giant bloodworm worm armor. White Gouda's slightly shocked voice sounded. The blood-red light emitted from the giant bloodworm's body suddenly solidified and formed an armor that flowed like blood. With the help of the blood-refined worm armor, The power of the giant bloodworm's self-destruction was increased by 20%. White Gouda was alarmed and ordered without hesitation. Don't be afraid. Let the opponent pay the price. Blood origin explosion. Boom. The giant bloodworm's eyes flashed red. It actually self-destructed before it came into contact with the baby green-eyed dragon. This method was considered decisive. The waves of blood from the self-destruction of the giant bloodworm rushed towards the baby green-eyed dragon. The baby green-eyed dragon that rushed in fearlessly was swallowed by the explosion in the blink of an eye. However, it suddenly let out a long cry and broke through the waves of blood. It bit towards the blue magic ball. White Gouda held the blood demon card tightly in his hand. However, the summoning skill that required 5 seconds was only halfway through, and the baby green-eyed dragon's huge mouth had already wrapped around the blue magic ball. He clenched his teeth. Between stopping the summoning and controlling the magic ball to escape or continuing the summoning, he chose the latter. As he had seen more than one case of being chased to death because of controlling the magic ball and not having time to summon, he subconsciously chose to gamble on his luck. However, when the blood demon card in his hand had just popped out half of its head from the card, the blue magic ball that was caught off guard was already bitten into pieces by the baby green-eyed dragon. If it had 8,000 HP, it could still hold on for a while. However, with only 2,000 MP, it would not be able to withstand the bite of the baby green-eyed dragon no matter what. Bang! As the life barrier was completely broken, the magic light spots that it emitted scattered like stars. Its MP returned to 0. 20000. Victory and defeat would never give you the time to prepare yourself mentally. The summoning light of the blood demon finally landed on the blue summoning area. That blood-red skinned demon instinctively bit towards the baby green-eyed dragon beside it. However, without using its ultimate skill, it was completely unable to break through the scales of the baby green-eyed dragon. The baby green-eyed dragon opened its cute big eyes. After the victory was determined, it used its 2 dragon claws to clamp onto its head. It raised its hands and rubbed it, just like rubbing a dog's head. This little episode added a lot of color to the match that ended too quickly. The audience outside the arena only woke up from the shock of Dake's special summon of the 6-star dragon species until now. No matter if it was the holy aura and awe-inspiring dragon aura that the baby dragon emitted, or the overly fast moves, it was all shocking. Dake Diming's supermodel was becoming more and more like a supermodel. As for White Gouda, who was defeated faster than Justin Wayne by a second, it could no longer attract attention. After all, no matter who it was very likely that the result would be the same. Failure was not scary. What was scary was that other people, even oneself, thought that failure was inevitable. White Gouda, who did not feel too depressed because of this, when he raised his hand to recall the blood demon, he only felt a sense of loss without much fluctuation. Chapter 446. Both contestants left the stage after putting away their magic cards. What greeted White was Luoboat's comforting look of, "You really didn't make it past one round." On the other hand, Dark returned to his original position in an ordinary manner. The duel assessment continued. Even though they were allowed to leave the arena after participating in this round of assessment, no one did so as a matter of course. The 2 rounds of duel assessment finally ended when the sky outside the venue darkened. Professor Cheong-si gave a good affirmation to the performance of the first-year students, and then announced that they were dismissed. It's finally over. I wonder how many points we can get in this assessment. It can't be too low. After all, we worked so hard. That's true. At least we weren't defeated in one round. Hey, it seems that the school championship duel is tomorrow morning. I want to watch it. But after the weekend, it'll be the final written exam. Oh, is the exam more important or the duel? Of course it's the exam. The students always seemed very rational when they were talking seriously, but when the time came, they would be dominated by their emotions. The Shungmalian School Championship duel was a very famous competition. It was almost to the point where it was difficult to get a ticket. Every year, the school championship duel would attract countless people to watch. And every time this happened, the tickets to the venue would be sold at a sky-high price. Fortunately, the parents of the students had special privileges. They only needed to use their identity to get free tickets from the branch library in the corresponding area. Although these tickets couldn't be transferred, it provided convenience for the parents. Basically, no parents wanted to sell the tickets. In this era where the status of magisters was increasing day by day, the families whose children could be recruited into the Shungmalian Academy would quickly become rich even if they weren't originally rich. After leaving the No. 1 battle hall, the Dake trio went to the Traveler's Street. They booked a table at the Waltz restaurant and celebrated the end of the practical assessment. There were a total of 4 practical tests, and all 3 of them performed above the passing line. Even though Professor Thompson's Potionology and Professor Ka Zayer's Introduction to Magic had set up a more difficult practical test, which caused Luosi and Deanna to fail. Even though they were not as good as the top students, they were more than good enough to pass the test. Although there were a total of 6 theory exams from Monday to Wednesday, the most difficult math exam was their strength. As long as they studied hard, they would be able to pass the other 5 exams. Therefore, he could take a look at the weekend's Branch Academy duel. The 3 of them chatted happily in the Waltz restaurant, looking forward to tomorrow's duel. This was especially true for Dake. Today's duel test had piqued his interest, but it couldn't satisfy him at all. Whether it was Justin or White, they were all too inferior. Second year is enough. When they reached the second year, most of the activities in the academy were no longer restricted, and there were many stages for them to compete with the senior students. At that time, the richer side of school life would gradually be revealed. Dake looked forward to the future while observing the way the 2 girls ate. Deanna's appetite was as good as ever. She ate in big mouthfuls without restraint, and from time to time, she would stick out her pink tongue and lick the grease on her lips. Luosi, on the other hand, was more reserved, but when she saw something she liked, she couldn't help but show a greedy look. However, at such a young age, she seemed to have the self-awareness to maintain her figure, and she resisted the urge to eat as much as she wanted. Dake seemed to see a bit of himself in her, and he couldn't help but smile. Luosi felt his gaze and her face turned red. She touched her face, and after confirming that there were no stains, she looked confused. Dake hurriedly lowered his head and ate the food on his plate, so that he wouldn't be mistaken for hentai. The next morning, Saturday, Dake and the 2 girls agreed to meet in the common lounge, and then they went to the outdoor dueling arena together. As expected, the ring around the arena was densely packed with people. It seemed that all the high and low-grade students of the academy had come. Of course, the first-year students were no exception. The first-year students who said that they had to hurry up and study appeared in the audience seats in the ring. The Noble Courtyard, the Knight Courtyard, the Sorcerer Courtyard, and the Fool's Courtyard. The ring was divided into 4 areas. There were banners and flags in each area. All the students were prepared to cheer for their respective schools. Dake arrived a little late. He, Deanna, and Luosi walked in the direction of the Noble Courtyard area, and found that the first-year students were all sitting in the back row. Doran was the first to notice his arrival, and hurriedly stood up and waved at him. "Hey Dake, I thought you weren't coming." "Why wouldn't I come?" Dake smiled and sat down behind Doran. The whole row of seats was empty, just enough to accommodate the 3 of them. "How is it going, Doran? What time is it going to start?" Deanna leaned on the back of the front row seat and asked with a cute face. Doran glanced at her and said, "Of course it's 8 o'clock. This duel is very important to us as it concerns the ownership of the school championship competition. Whether or not we can get the chance to make a wish depends on our seniors." Deanna nodded. Oh. Doran suddenly rolled his eyes and took out a stick-like object from below. He waved it at Dake and the other 2. "Look, what is this?" Dake followed. "What is it?" Doran immediately said, "It's a fireworks stick. When the seniors of the Noble Courtyard win, I'll spin this and then, bang." As he spoke, he suddenly opened his hand and was very excited. Dake couldn't help but laugh. 8 o'clock sharp. The bell from the direction of the spiral clock tower reverberated leisurely. The outer spectator seats behind the circular belt suddenly rippled like water waves, and the projections of spectators from various branches appeared in the spectator seats one after another. The school championship competition of the Shungmalian Academy was, in essence, a stage for the students to show their talents to the outside world. The reputation of the Shungmalian Academy was maintained in these duels. And those who came to watch this competition, in addition to the parents of the students and the normal audience, were all kinds of famous people. The Shungmalian Academy was the world's largest magisters production base. The magisters who came out of the academy every year could lead the industry trend. And the students who could represent each branch to participate in the duel were definitely the best of each grade. Even if they were not the first, they were most likely the second. Especially the 4 students who represented the 6th grade in the competition, they were definitely worth paying attention to. It could be said that grasping their movements was equivalent to grasping the direction of the era. Therefore, this year's school championship duel was also unprecedentedly grand. Of course, the individual fans of the students were also countless. In fact, the moment the space hub was connected, the audience burst into thunderous cheers. The supporters of each student were clearly divided. Among them, there was a line of people who held the Silver Dragon flag high, because there was no doubt that the Silver Dragon girl would represent the 4th grade of the Magic Engineering Academy. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Shungmalian Duel Arena. This time Judy, who was also in charge of hosting, appeared in the middle of the stage after a burst of fluorescent light, accompanied by fluttering petals. Today, senior sister Judy was wearing a tailored magic robe. Her light brown curly hair was tied up high, revealing her slender neck, making her look more mature and gorgeous. Before the contestants came on stage, she was obviously the most gorgeous flower in the audience. There seemed to be hardcore fans of senior sister Judy in the audience. At that moment, the sound of the explosion overwhelmed the audience. The circular belt. Dake looked at the glamorous senior sister Judy on the stage and couldn't help but ask, "Speaking of which, what is senior sister Judy's real name?" He was actually asking Doran in the front row, but Deanna next to him blinked and said, "Dake's senior sister Judy is so beautiful." Dake nodded and said, "She is very beautiful, but in a few years, Deanna will definitely be more beautiful than her." Deanna laughed, hee. Dake asked again, "But which school is senior sister Judy from? Which year is she from?" Thinking about it carefully, she has never revealed it. "This," Deanna said. "Anyway, she is not from the aristocratic academy." "That's true," Dake nodded. "If she is from the aristocratic academy, she should have an impression." Luosi also curiously said, "It seems that I have never heard of this senior sister's full name. Which school is she from?" The 3 of them looked at each other, and suddenly realized that they seemed to have found a mystery. It was not difficult to solve this mystery. But sometimes, leaving the mystery behind was also a kind of beauty. Duang. The sudden sound of music on the stage once again attracted Dake's attention. The band that appeared out of thin air played the famous Husker on His Deathbed, with absolute strength. The atmosphere of the whole stadium became formal. Then, under the guidance of senior sister Judy, a total of 20 contestants from 4 schools of 5 grades walked up the stage from behind the curtain. Because they were representing their school, every contestant was wearing a formal school uniform, with school badges and dueling badges. But other than that, it was obvious that everyone had been touched up with makeup. The girls were delicate and picturesque, while the boys were handsome and heroic. The 20 contestants were in groups of 5 and stood from left to right. Then senior sister Judy gave a simple self-introduction to each contestant. Dake listened carefully and found that there were a few familiar faces. First, there was Panduola Doragon from the Magic School. As a famous Shungmalian celebrity, senior sister Panduola represented the Magic School as the champion of the 4th grade. Then there was Winnie Scaldi from the Magic School. This senior sister, who was unexpectedly eliminated by the 3rd grade Tom Nixon at the Easter Dueling Festival, appeared on the dueling stage again. But this time, her demeanor was clearly different. She was clearly serious. And the 3rd grade representative from the House of Fools was not Tom Nixon. The 2nd grade representative from the House of Nobles was also not Elsie Kevin or Mary Bond, who Dake was more familiar with. Instead, the 5th grade representative from the Knight Academy was still the Knight Baron Noah Sharp. As for the 5th grade representative from the House of Fools, it was not the Dragon Slayer, Luke Beck. Dake curiously looked at the unfamiliar seniors, and suddenly noticed that senior sister Panduola was staring at him. He couldn't help but smile and raise his hand to wave. Deanna and Luosi looked at each other, and immediately raised their hands to wave, cheering for senior sister Panduola. Then, Doran suddenly turned around and asked in confusion, "Why are you cheering for the magic school? That's our mortal enemy this year." If the House of Nobles wanted to win the school championship this year, the magic school was the biggest threshold in front of them. Doran naturally didn't like it. "You don't understand." Deanna put down her hand and said in an old voice, "We have a good relationship with senior sister. If senior sister wins, we're happy. If senior sister loses, we're happy. It's a win-win situation." Luosi couldn't help but cover her mouth and laugh. "I think it's the secret to smiling all the time." Doran only felt that this woman was really unreasonable, and turned his head with a dark face. Dake couldn't help but snicker. The school championship duel, referred to as the school championship, officially kicked off at around 9 o'clock. According to the regular competition system, 5 contestants from each branch would form a group, and each group would have a duel with the other 3 groups. The winner of each duel could win 10,000 temporary credits for the branch. There were a total of 6 rounds of duels between groups, and each round had 5 duels. After these 6 rounds, it would be the year-skipping challenge. The contestants would choose seniors from other branches who were higher in grade than them to challenge them. In addition to the 10,000 basic credits, the winner would also receive additional year-skipping challenge credits, 10,000 for each level. By the end of the competition, the branch with the most accumulated points would receive a reward of 100,000 credits. These credits would be counted in the school championship duel. When the contestants finished their introductions and left the stage one after another, senior sister Judy activated a magic card and summoned the symbols of the 4 branches: the crown, the lance, the grimoire, and the Fool tarot card. Then she arranged these 4 symbols in a circle and moved the pointer in the middle. After 2 moves, the pointer pointed to the crown and the grimoire respectively. This meant that the first round of the school championship duel would be between the aristocratic courtyard and the magic courtyard. The 2 branches with the highest credits clashed in the first round, instantly causing the atmosphere to rise. Between the students of the aristocratic courtyard and the magic courtyard, it was as if there were flashes of lightning. The atmosphere was anxious. The cheerleaders of both sides suddenly raised their flags, cheered with high morale, and started the battle off the stage. And the contestants of the 2 branches also appeared on the stage one after another. 2 and 1 4,000 plus. Let's see how much I can write before tomorrow morning. That you're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.